Hello and welcome everyone to Prussia, Execution of a Nation. I hope that many of you on the stream have already heard of Prussia and know to some extent what it is. We're going to be going into more depth as providing an introduction for what Prussia is. But Execution of a Nation, what do I mean by that? Prussia is remarkable in the sense that it has such a profound impression upon the history of Europe from the 18th century up until the 20th century specifically, albeit there are impressions even before that. But Prussia is a nation that was sentenced to damnation in memory in more senses than one, and actually had the ignominious fate of having been effectively prescribed and sentenced to death posthumously. So execution of a nation has meta connotations. It has connotations in terms of how we can describe the diminution of Prussia, both in terms of its territory, its state, its consciousness, all the elements that comprise it, and you can say are emblematic of what it means to be Prussia. But at the end of the Second World War, a couple of years later in 1947, Lieutenant Generals Clay of America, Brian Robertson of the United Kingdom, and Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky declared the Law 46 from the Allied Control Commission, which is stated thusly: the Prussian state, which from early days had been the bearer of militarism and reaction in Germany, has de facto ceased to exist. What they mean by de facto ceased to exist is that its territory and its population have basically been purged, forced into exile as a result of the ethnic cleansing of the German populations in now what is the territory of Poland, which more or less half of which was the former possessions of Prussia. So continuing on. Guided by the interest of preservation of peace and security of peoples, and with the desire to assure further reconstruction of the political life of Germany on a democratic basis, the Control Council enacts as follows: that the Prussian state with its central government and all its agencies is abolished. So this isn't simply a declaration that Prussia should be abolished. This is a damning indictment on the Prussian state, representing militarism, reaction, and a scourge on a democratic basis for a post-World War II German state. So this isn't simply the dissolution of a nation. This is the execution of a nation. Everything that Prussia represents is to be antithetical to any sort of new German construct which is supposed to sort of rise from it. As for the purview of the stream today, I'm going to be mainly focusing on with Marcus here the elements of Prussia that perhaps those of you who are Prussophiles or interested in Prussian history aren't necessarily that aware of, which is what happened to Prussia after the original German unification, and specifically what happened to Prussia after the flight of the Kaiser in 1918. So the strange afterlife of Prussia from 1918 to 1947. We're going to be trying to ascertain what Prussia truly represented, whether Prussia can effectively be, an idea of Prussia is actually consistent with this idea that the Allies have prescribed Prussia to death in Law 46. All of these things, the thematic sort of through lines of what Prussia is supposed to represent, the history of that period in particular, those 29 years. But without further ado, I want to introduce my guest, who of course is a mainstay on this channel, Marcus Pertinax. Hello.
Hello and good evening. Sadly, a rather morbid topic today, but one that deserves its day in the sun, and one that ought to be probably talked about more openly, because it is it's quite the shocking thing when you really sort of get into the brass tacks of it, and how it's funny that I don't want to sort of like send this onto an immediate tangent, but the eternal paradox of how you might say continental Europe was liberated, shall I say, from the regime of the interwar Germans, the mid-century Germans, and everything that supposedly coincides with liberation being one such concept, but liberation coming along with the severing and the vaporization of an entire state, and its history and the tarnishing of its reputation forevermore, being a fundamental part of that process, I sort of find quite ironic.
Well, you're probably going to be coming at this stream more from a Prussian-centric point of view. My background is more in Austria and actually more in Bavaria, and it's quite interesting actually coming at this topic right now because I've been covering Austria and Bavaria quite extensively. In fact, I was positing counterfactuals about how Ludwig II could have featured more prominently. He was obviously King of Bavaria from
Hmm.
64 until 1886, how he could have featured more prominently in the story of German unification. Uh, but nevertheless, another irony you can consider is that the late 18th century and the 19th century are to some extent the the history of Prussia's rise to power and its assumption of great power status. Whereas if you look at the other nations I just mentioned, Austria and Bavaria, you would think in the grand scheme of things that they were history's greatest losers. However, it is perhaps the least of those three nations, Bavaria, which is now the most sort of wealthy, most populous, and the most sort of culturally proud and defiant of all those nations. Austria
One might arguably say even idyllic if you visit it.
And Austria, of course, still exists and exists as an independent nation,
Mm,
slightly poorer than Bavaria, which exists within the Federal Republic of Germany.
indeed.
Austria, of course, was horrifically dismembered, but nevertheless, there is a core Austria which still exists today. Nothing can be said of Prussia. The original territory of East Prussia is now divided among Poland and even Russia in the Kaliningrad Oblast, which is effectively a Russian colony. And
Mm,
what is left of the remnant of Prussia is Brandenburg, which is in and of itself an identity which actually harkens back before the creation of Prussia, before the kingdom in 1701. So the cruel irony of all of this is that Prussia looms very large among the historical sort of trajectory of Europe, and it suffers a fate which is far more severe than the two quote unquote losers when it comes to the history of Europe compared to Prussia. Austria and Bavaria. You can imagine Bismarck's consternation looking just after the Battle of Königgrätz and the proclamation of the German Empire that Prussia would basically cease to exist only 50 years after his death.
mm.
So, what I want to ask you, just for a brief introduction, obviously I've hinted the fact that Prussia is a quote unquote great power, and also the idea of a great power is something that we discussed when talking about the whole notion of Swedish power recently in our last week's
Mhm.
topic. But broadly summarized, where does Prussia come from and why is it relevant?
I suppose you're asking the wrong person for a brief summary, but um, interestingly enough, is the acquisition of Prussia into the electorate of Brandenburg. You're talking sort of right at the tail end of the Middle Ages and sort of entering the Renaissance period, and the amalgamation essentially of the Duchy of Prussia into the what was then known as the Mark Brandenburg, or the Mark of Brandenburg, I
Just a
suppose.
reference for what the Duchy of Prussia is. In the 12th and the 13th century, there were a series of wars called the Wendish Crusades. The old borders of Prussia or sort of Germany, were laid down along the River Elbe, which is more or less close to the modern boundary of Germany, which is the Oder-Neckar line.
Hmm.
But throughout the 12th and the 13th century, there were a series of crusades which expanded at the expense of the Slavs, the Sorbians, the Wends, and ultimately the Poles and the Baltic peoples of the old Prussians.
At
So
the
by
hands of the Teutonic and Livonian orders, of course.
Yes,
Like,
so by
yeah.
the beginning of the 15th century, Germans had expanded. A Baltic German presence was established in the modern-day Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia. But as you can see in the east, the former Baltic territories of the old Prussian people was transformed into an enclave or a last redoubt of the Teutonic Order. So the Germans expanded eastwards, and this is part of something called the Aussiedlung, the eastern settling. So Prussia represents this original sort of colonizing zeal and drive, this crusader spirit at the expense of Slav lands, as opposed to within the Holy Land itself. But the history of Prussia isn't simply an extension of that, because the Teutonic Order was defeated by the Poles. The remnant, which you can see in green on the eastern side of this map, the right side of the map, was secularized and created as Prussia, which became a vassal of Poland. And the protagonist and ultimately the vehicle for the creation of the Kingdom of Prussia wasn't the Prussian enclave in and of itself, albeit that history, that trajectory still exists, but the territory you can see right in the center of the map, which is the Margravate of Brandenburg, which was also an electorate within the Holy Roman Empire. So just for a bit of context there as to where these places come from.
Indeed. And just on the topic of the Osteidlung, we did a stream on that at least a couple of years ago. So for those who fancy watching that, please go watch it in the catalogue. And yeah, so you're talking at well, this map here dates at the beginning of the 1600s, and you have the amalgamation of the Margravate of Brandenburg, or the electorate of Brandenburg, and the Duchy of Prussia. They sort of become one nation, if you can call it that. And as you can see here on this map, this power gradually acquires territory, particularly in what, well, was previously East Germany, because what is today's East Germany is technically Middle Germany. But here through Pomerania and Silesia, gradually this country does sort of grow in size, and markedly so under the reign of Frederick the Great, and sort of gradually becomes a local power to a regional power, you know, to a European power, and eventually in the form of the German Empire post, 1871, a world power, obviously, or at least it sort of accumulates or congregates the various territories of the majority of Germany into a singular empire under the Hohenzollern dynasty. And this is a process that's taken several centuries, but you sort of see this map represents the sort of embryonic beginnings of that. And really, I mean, to be honest with you, it could have been Brandenburg, it could have been any other electorate, just so happened to have been Brandenburg and its union with the Duchy of Prussia at the beginning of this time period.
It's interesting that you mentioned it could have been any nation. Obviously, the whole sort of drive towards German nationality is something that comes to the fore in the 19th century, which is why sort of looking back at a trajectory of what Prussia represents is basically the final destiny of sort of German nationality. It wasn't at all obvious in the 18th century. Frederick II the Great, the ruler who was most identified with the cause of the Hohenzollern dynasty, wasn't thinking about a German nation state. He was thinking about the viability of his own dynastic possession. So
Correct.
I mentioned at the beginning that this is the idea of an execution of a nation. Well, what really is a nation here? What is remarkable about the state of Prussia, as I mentioned, leaning back on the old process of the Aussiedlung, the eastern settling, is that as a result of Prussia sort of moving far into the east, virtually very little of old Prussia retains its sort of territorial distinctiveness within the new Germany, as in the old Prussia. Because when you think of what it essentially means to be Prussia, you're basically thinking of one particular area of Prussia, which is why I bring up this map in particular, which is East Elbe, east of the Elbe. This is the Prussia represented by a militant class of aristocrats with extensive land holdings, where the basis of wealth from the lands is agriculture in the former Polish territories and in East Prussia. And this class are the Junkers. The Junkers, under the reign of the Great Elector and later Frederick Wilhelm I and Frederick II of Prussia, formed the backbone of what was known as the service nobility, service to the state in the army of Prussia. And Prussia had such a large army in contrast to the size of its economy and in contrast to the size of its population. Just to put this in perspective, around the time of the death of Frederick II and the sort of reign of Joseph II of Austria, Prussia was around a tenth of the economy and the population of Austria, and yet it was able to field an army which, if not necessarily the equal in size of Austria, was comparative, which is sort of rather remarkable to consider. So there's this idea of Prussia and this specific idea of that Junkerish, feudal, agrarian society existing east of the Elbe. That in itself can form a core identity as to what we can basically say is a nation, and indeed a nation whose extinction, extermination, execution, whatever, is made all the more potent by the fact that most of these territories are now part of Poland. But nevertheless, we should also consider the other idea, which is Prussia as existing as nothing more than a dynastic consideration. You mentioned Prussia as the vehicle for German unification, and the reason why Prussia was responsible for the unification of Germany and not Austria is because German unification was won under Prussia, not by Prussia amalgamating into other states, but Prussian domination, Prussian hegemony through force of arms, hail to thee, the victor's crown. Um, it is the Prussian army under the direction of the Minister President Bismarck, basically the statesman genius, who was able to bring about a Bonapartist solution, amalgamating, you can say, the hopes and aspirations of the liberal Germanophile intelligentsia who want to see Germany rise as a nation compared to the hard power of a ruling aristocracy and the interests of the Hohenzollern dynasty. And so, in that sense, you can look at this old Prussia, the Prussia before the Napoleonic Wars, and say that this, in many ways, actually has a far more distinct, coherent territorial identity to it as compared to the second Prussia, which is after, which you can see on these maps here. There's very little in terms, already Prussia has lost territories to Russia as part of the reevaluations, the partitions of Poland after the defeat of Napoleon. But Germany is created by Prussia expanding into Germany, effectively. The territories in the middle you see weren't originally part of the post-Napoleonic conception of Prussia, Hanover and Schleswig-Holstein and other smaller enclaves like Frankfurt and parts of Brunswick, etc. But as Prussia expands more into Germany, this whole notion of the domination of the East Elbia, the whole sort of east of the River Elbe conception of Prussia, is diluted. Prussia becomes a dynastic construction within the whole construct of a united German nation, and basically is able to exert a stranglehold over the interests of Germany itself. The minister-president, the prime minister of Prussia, during the Kaiserreich, the period of the German Empire under the Hohenzollern emperors and kings, is also the chancellor of Germany, which was a contrivance brought in by Bismarck himself. So all of these things are wedding Prussia specifically as a vehicle for German identity, German unification. And what is essentially cited in the original Law 46, which I brought up, this idea of militarism and reaction, the Allied response to the abolition of Prussia wouldn't be such a damning indictment of its history, were it not for the fact that Prussia was the instrument of German unification. Because Prussia is seen as the instrument of unification, thereby all of the elements associated with Prussia, in the view of the Allies, all of the pejorative elements, are seen basically as holding Germany back. It becomes this reactionary throwback, this militaristic throwback, and we come to the idea of the Sonderweg and the whole idea that Germany had a stunted, anachronistic path to quote-unquote modernity, which of course is social democratic sort of liberal democracy, thanks to the all-pervasiveness of Prussia. What really ought to have happened during the 19th century, according to the people who sort of believe in this sort of thing, is that Prussia should have been sort of subsumed by Germany, not Germany subsumed by Prussia, if that makes sense. But because Prussia is also a dynastic construction, the whole notion of this nation existing separately from Germany becomes, completely sort of diffuse. The whole Prussian identity and German identity are creating some form of cultural and political osmosis, which comes to another point. We talked about Prussia simply representing a dynastic aspiration of the Hohenzollerns, but now we come to the idea of Prussia as representing a unique form of government, Prussia as representing the supremacy of the ideals of good government, Prussia as representing a superlative form of state and institutions. And when we look to this, we look to the legacy of Frederick the Great, enlightened absolutism, but also to the reformers in the aftermath of Prussia's defeat at the hands of Napoleon in the Fourth Coalition War, in particular figures such as Hardenberg and Stein. Just to say that Prussia, unlike what happened in the French Revolution, which is basically imposing the writ of sort of Napoleonic fiat on Europe by force, Hardenberg was effectively able to create a white revolution from above. Prussia was led by an incredibly weak king, Frederick Wilhelm III, during that time, who ruled for a very long time, for about 50 years, during a crucial part in during Prussia's existence. But it is during the reign of, you can see the supervision of Hardenberg, that Prussia abolishes serfdom, which you can see is actually a attack on the Prussian feudal nature, the aristocracy, expands the civil service to be open to the bourgeoisie, or the Bürgerliche in German, but it also extends the whole nation of Prussian education, secular education, which had also been begun under the auspices of Frederick the Great also. And when we see the expansion of Prussia as a result of the victory against Napoleon, we also see Prussia expanding from its Protestant core. In, I believe it's the year 1818, Prussia has this unique affected system whereby the Calvinist and Lutheran churches in Prussia amalgamate as part of the evangelical state church of Prussia, of which the head of the House of Hohenzollern, the Emperor of Germany and the King of Prussia, is also the head. But now you have vast sections of Catholic populations in the West who have been added to Prussia. And I mentioned, Marcus, this idea of the East Elben stereotype, this cliche of Prussia. Against that, against Protestant landed interests in the East, what do we have in the West? We have Catholic and soon to be largely industrialized areas. So Prussia in and of itself represents, you can say, two competing ideas. You can say two almost mutually incompatible ideas, and yet somehow Prussia under Bismarck is able to take these two ideas. It's not just that the German army is the vehicle for German unification, but it is German Prussian industrialization, which is also the vehicle of German unification. The states such as
and
Bavaria,
also driving force of the strengthening of the country as well. Like,
yes,
writ
say for
large.
example, Bavaria is relatively under-industrialized, but it's the economic might of Prussia which gives an incentive for the smaller German states to buy into the German project rather than simply being determined that they've been determined for them by force of arms, effectively. So already we're moving away from this original Prussian notion, whereby you can say Prussia is far more distinct as an entity existing east. I mean, that territory is almost entirely within Poland, with the exception of the Mark of Brandenburg.
And markedly more contiguous.
Yes, and now we come to this territory. So what do you have to say in terms of alluding to the idea very early on that part of the friction of this idea within Prussia itself is this Prussian dualism?
Just two sort of points I'd like to tack on to this talking point is that you got to think the only Catholic remnants that would have existed in. Can you just go to the other picture of Germany, of Prussia, the more contiguous old? Yeah. So when you even the other one's fine, but when you look at that picture there, see, you would have had this sort of Prussian Lutheran Calvinist sort of. The Prussians themselves are predominantly that, with probably a smattering of.
And most of the Catholic populations that actually exist in the territory aren't German at all; they're Polish.
You read my mind. I was going to say there might have been like a slither of the ethnic Germans who were themselves Catholic, but the majority of Catholics in this nation, as you see here, were of a Polish minority. And then when you incorporate the Rhineland Germans into the reformed Prussia post-Napoleon, you have these newcomers into the state who don't have a history of being a part of Prussia, are brought into Prussia, who are Catholic, and they share religiosity with the one ethnic minority that exists within the state of Prussia, which is the Polish minority in the east, centered around Bromberg, Posen, in parts of like southern Prussia and in sort of eastern Silesia. And this obviously creates friction at many levels. The other point I wanted to raise briefly about the Rhineland is that there's sort of an interesting history here, whereby there's an old phrase that's used in French politics. It's used prior to Napoleon. It's even used after Napoleon. Then there's the idea of France's natural borders, which is obviously the Rhine River, and I believe is it the in 1803, where Napoleon sort of creates the Confederation of the Rhine, and so basically all the territories west of the Rhine are brought into sort of cosmopolitan France, as it were, into territorial France, and then a lot of these small states that straddle the Ruhr Valley throughout the Rhineland are brought together. It's technically under the electorate of the electorate of Baden and the Duchy of Württemberg, and sort of brought together in this Confederation of the Rhine. And in doing so, I believe over 100 sort of separate territories were sort of absorbed by, their larger neighbours, as it were, and sort of all these old ecclesiastical sort of independent archbishoprics are just deleted from the map, essentially.
Yeah, this is a
And it's
process in German history called the mediatizations, if you want to look more into that.
exactly, and um, so this is solidified also in the sort of the post, well, it's rather made concrete in the sort of after the defeat of Prussia at the hands of Napoleon,
Yes, in the
following the Treaty of
Confederation,
Tilsit.
in the Rhinebund, Napoleon basically carves out around 40 states, and
Yeah.
those between 36 and 40 states basically become the nucleus of the post-Napoleonic German Confederation.
Correct. And the bulk of what would become the Confederation of the Rhine ends up essentially being given to Prussia after the defeat of Napoleon in sort of 1814, 1815. And so these, with the exception of a few fringe territories, if you see on one of these older maps, you can see that I think if you can go back to that older map, it actually had the names. I think it was like Cleve. Yeah, here you go. Minden, Osnabrück, Cleve.
Yeah,
They were
the
these
Kliesmark, yeah.
the Kliesmark. They were these sort of like external exclaves, but they were very small and sort of they weren't contiguous. They weren't particularly powerful or even greatly important. But when sort of post the defeat of Napoleon, and you have this massive sort of contiguous territory of the former Confederation of the Rhine that is then brought into Prussia. You have all this new territory that wasn't formerly Prussia brought into Prussia, a whole bunch of Catholics that were not citizens of Prussia, then sort of made citizens. Prussia has this sort of contiguous territory that sort of reaches right, not just through Germany, but you got to think straddles Germany east and west, essentially necessitating the creation of Belgium as an in between, as a wedge between France and the German states, so to speak. And this is sort of a creation of the so-called wisdom of the victors following the Napoleonic Wars, and this would have ramifications that sort of tie into the entirety of the 19th century and beyond. I just wanted to make the point about the Confederation of the Rhine because not many people would know about it, and I think it's an interesting point.
Well, there are many interesting elements that you bring up that can sort of lead on to other points. One, which is that this is basically a mishap, and one that the Prussians at the time weren't particularly happy about. You mentioned the idea of Belgium. Well, Belgium wasn't actually conceived of at this time. It was the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, which included both
Correct.
Belgium
Yeah.
and the Netherlands. And this existed until 1830. But the remarkable thing is that Prussia was awarded this territory based on this spurious amalgamation, partly as compensation for the fact, as you can see, Prussia has more territory in Poland here than it has here. So basically, it's okay, Russia has taken these territories, we'll compensate Prussia with these territories in the West. But moreover,
Russia essentially absorbed what became the Duchy of Warsaw.
yeah,
In
Congress
the
Poland.
Napoleonic times. Yeah, Congress
And
Poland. Yeah.
what this territory is basically, okay, Germany, Prussia. Prussia now has responsibility for preventing further French, incursions into Germany. So we're going to award you this territory. And the Prussians weren't exactly very happy about that. But it was a godsend in hindsight because this is the territory where the German Industrial Revolution really is going to take off in earnest. But there's another element here, which is something that builds into this idea of Prussiandom or Prussian identity, which is during the war against the French coalition, I mean, the Prussians had a rather ignominious history in the sense that they profited very well from Napoleon's original conquests. They were able to consolidate a lot of territory, gain much through the mediatizations, and get compensated for the territory they lost around the bank of the Rhine. Nevertheless, due to reasons I won't get into on the stream, partly over Hanover, they go to war with France, Prussia against war with France between 1806 and 1807. And this sliver of Prussia you can see in the center of the map, the blue, is all that remains after this war. But it is during the 1812 campaign that Prussia dramatically switches sides and breaks off this vassalage, this imposed alliance, which has been, forced to take with the French, with Napoleon, by one general, General Field Marshal York, switching sides, agreeing to this Convention of Tauroggen against the wishes of the king, it should be said, basically compelling the Prussians right at the end of Napoleon's retreat to switch sides. And it's from this point onwards that Prussia is basically seen as the great vehicle of German emancipation vis-a-vis the French. It is Prussian arms under Blücher, at Leipzig, and of course at Waterloo. Blücher won the Battle of Waterloo as much as Wellington did. And so all of a sudden, Prussia, from a historical point, and this is something that Goebbels would use extensively in his propaganda, is seen as the vehicle of the defense of the nation, the defense of national borders. In the 7 Years' War, it's used at the expense of the Russians and the French, and in the Napoleonic Wars, it's also used at the expense of the French, and they gain the territories of the Rhineland as a result. And Bismarck, brilliantly, is able to play on that fear of the French and their desires to retake those territories, which was policy of Napoleon III. Napoleon III, say, for example, tried to annex Luxembourg. He tried to wrestle over the Bavarian territory of the Rhinish Palatinate. He tried to get the territory of the Prussian Rhineland exchanged for a potential sort of Silesian, not Silesian, but German unification during the sort of War of 1866, all of these things. And Bismarck was able to play dramatically on this fear of France to rally all of the German states together, and his masterstroke with the Elms Dispatch, the ultimatum, France declares war on Prussia, and all of a sudden the fears in the Napoleonic Wars are realized again, and Prussia is basically able to unite the country under the mantra, you can say a very artificial mantra because this is very much affected, it's not necessarily genuine, of Prussia defending the German states against the bellicose French Second Empire under Napoleon III. So as you can see, the identity of Prussia goes on from expanding at the sake of other German states and launching this spectacular conquest of the province you can see in the south, which is Silesia, at the expense of the Austrians. It becomes a great player in power politics during the later 18th century, but during the 19th century, Prussia is seen almost as synonymous with the cause of the defense of the German nation, but in particular, it is a Prussian formation of Germany. And that is, again, part of the legacy of what we see in the boundaries of Germany today, which is the Kleindeutschland, a little Germany, one that excludes Austria. And the basis of this original Prussian unification of Germany, which would later be torn apart when we see the rise of the National Socialists, is this idea that the smaller states can have their power is lesser vis-a-vis Prussia compared to if Austria also became part of a greater German solution. So the whole nature of German unification, this whole notion of a lesser German solution, of the new Kaiserreich under the Hohenzollern emperors, means that the whole sort of tempo of German unification takes place under the auspices of Prussia and the great minister-president Bismarck. And again, going back to this whole notion of why Prussia was executed, it is these elements which are seen as so incongruent with the rise of liberal democratic institutions and the rise of Prussia as in being able to replicate the institutions of Great Britain and France and the Netherlands, etc. All of these elements, you can say, you can't separate Prussia from the history of Germany and from the history of German unification. And so that in a way makes the whole cause against Prussia from a historical standpoint and from a diplomatic and military standpoint all the more necessary. And just to compound that point, Marcus, I would like to have your opinion on what is the Prussian relationship as a state with the Prussian army.
I see. You gave me you palmed me off on the easy one, because there's that old phrase, right, that most states have an army, and of course the Prussian army has a state. To what degree that I may or may not think that's true is probably almost the stream within itself. But needless to say, the armed forces did have a preeminent role, in Prussian life and in Prussian government. And it's funny because we have drawn a lot from Christopher Clark's book, Iron Kingdom. And there is an anecdote in there. There's a story that, because I haven't actually read the book in many years. Only sort of we agreed to do this together like only a day or so ago. But I do remember from when I read it, there was an anecdote of a story of a man who basically dressed as a Prussian officer and orchestrated a heist, I think at the very beginning of the 1900s. And so there's this notion of militaristic obedience to men in uniform and to officers, that he was able to carry out this heist with essentially no impediment, no obstacle. It was quite easy. And in fact, the Germans, contrary to what people often assume about Germans, they were actually quite sort of amused at the fact that they sort of fell foul of their own presumptions, of their own sort of military virtue. But Prussia was quite likely one of the very few countries where they could have a scoundrel could have pulled off such a thing in such a way. And just that anecdote, that story just stuck with me after I read it in that book. And I think also was because we did have a bit of a chat prior to the stream starting, and we wanted to talk about what are the origins of the so-called Prussian mindset that is vilified by, shall I say, specifically the liberal elements of the West. And this is a people and a country that withstood the worst ramifications, the worst consequences of the 30 Years' War, where much of the Altmark, the Uckermark, the territory of Brandenburg in and around what would become Berlin was ravaged by famine. They had to endure the billeting of troops from France and from Sweden and from the Habsburg Empire and from everywhere. And several battles were fought within their territory, and a lot of skirmishing was done, and a lot of a great deal of pillaging was taking place in terms of trying to acquire foodstuffs and ammunition, that sort of thing. The core of what would sort of become like the East German sort of core of territorial Prussia suffered terribly at the end of the 30 Years' War, which brings us to that point you mentioned about the disparity between their population, the size of their economy, and the size of their army. A line does come out, sort of spring to mind from that same book, where I think at the time which the Duchy of Prussia was unified with Brandenburg, that's, if you could call it a state at the time, but that state had, I think, the 21st largest population in Europe, yet was able to field the 12th largest army, which basically buttresses the point that you made about the
territorial mark is also deceptive, because that territory was also incredibly poor.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It had just been ravaged by the 30 Years' War, and itself, obviously Germany is a much more developed place now, and there's been a lot of earthworks, a lot of sort of essentially terraforming and whatever. But the Prussia, what do you call Mitteldeutschland, Middle Germany, of these sort of from the late 1500s to the beginning of the 1700s was essentially sort of forests and swampland broken up by river systems, the Elbe and the Oder-Nisse. So certainly was not a wealthy place. It wasn't Campania, it wasn't the Rhone Valley, it wasn't the Loire, it wasn't Bavaria even. It wasn't a particularly wealthy or productive part of the world. I mean, Germany has nutrient-rich soils, but in terms of that particular part of Germany, was just not well developed and was poor and had just been ravaged by continual warfare. And so the fact they were able to accomplish this was quite the feat, but it undoubtedly imbued in the people an attitude that probably, it's safe to say, had an enduring legacy, from that point onwards, and definitely shaped you might say, the characteristic nature of the Prussian state and the Prussian people. And that was obviously buttressed by the experience of the Napoleonic campaign. I mean, let's not sort of mince our words here. The battles of and the 7 Years' War, of course, yes. But the defeat, and you got to think, the Prussian army around the time of Napoleon is not a half-baked army. They are not incompetent. They are not inept. They are not they are not lacking in military virtue. They aren't even lacking in training or an officer corps or competent generals. But Napoleon and the Grande Armée wiped the floor with the Prussian army in the War of 1806, and the battles, particularly of Vienna and Auderstedt, were catastrophes for the Prussian army. And the fact that in a matter of months, Napoleon occupied the entirety of Prussia, with the exception of like a small little bit there across the is it the Neman River, where modern day Klaipėda is in Lithuania? I think the Prussians defend that, the Neman River, and the proud Prussian army is just eviscerated by Napoleon's Grande Armée, which was on one hand a terrible defeat in a pride sense, but also it probably redoubled their embracing of these virtues that they held tight. Essentially, I mean, it'd be worth comparing it to. It is in my opinion, it's sort of comparable to the Prussian Mos Maiorum in many ways, and I think when you sort of take into account that historical time period and the experiences of the Prussian state and people throughout that time period, this is how you end up, with that, dare I call it, a liberal prejudice towards it in the 20th century.
Well, you've alluded to this idea, this legendary conception of Prussiandom, which is born out by the experience of the 30 Years' War, the attempt to rectify that under the initiatives of the Great Elector, in the same way that you have Prussia's war against all in the 7 Years' War, which is a bit deceptive, is actually between 1758 and 1762, when Prussia was at war with France, with Austria, and with Russia, and it was only by the death of Tsarina Elizabeth and the ascent of Tsar Peter III that Prussia was ultimately spared and not dismembered. And
the great miracle,
Brandenburg, the two miracles of Brandenburg, it should be noted. But
Indeed.
This all comes down to, again, the quintessential idea of Prussian virtue, which I'm also going to lead into when it comes to the whole idea of Prussia as a superlative iteration of the state, because it goes beyond simply this idea of self-sacrifice and comes to the army. This is a segment taken from Wolfram von Wolmar's Requiem from Prussia, which was written in 1957, so 10 years after the death. So this is very much a lamentation. The state of Prussia, which, as we know better than ever before, was a European necessity. This political creation, which gave Germany a fresh start when the country was at death's door in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, now belongs to history, so compounding your point. Its living legacy consists in the virtues of doing one's duty, moderation, economy, its aristocratic social principle of preferring to be right than to seem, of doing a lot but displaying little, its toleration and its unshakable sense of right, and finally its austere, taught, reserved, and honest soul. No German state, no matter what forces mould and lead it, can renounce these virtues unless it also wishes to throw away frivolously a cultural inheritance without equal in Europe, together with its problems, but also together with its dignity, or unless it wishes to see German soul degenerated in the centre of Europe abandoned to the tender mercies of an imperialism, which Frederick the Great in his Testament of 1760 identified as a power which is dangerous for all of Europe. The imperialism, of course, which he's mentioning is happens to be Soviet imperialism, but also happens to be American imperialism, going back again to Law 46 and this idea of Prussia as exemplifying the antithesis of the democratic basis of a future Germany, militarism and reaction. So that compounds again the stereotype of Prussia, this legacy of privation and again austerity going back, and the willingness again to adopt self-sacrifice. But there's a caveat to that. You're obviously talking about the military angle there, but now we come to the idea of Prussia and the state institutions. Ironically, again, going back to the legacy of Hardenberg and the expansion of the Prussian civil service, the civil service in Prussia had the legend of basically representing both the Junker aristocracy, but also you can say bourgeois values. In many senses, you can say austerity, focus on like fiscal responsibility, middle class morals, effectively, so to speak, as opposed to, you can say, the liberal and the excessive nature of some sort of elements of the cliche sort of aristocratic culture. These elements were infused in the whole idea of the Prussian state as being anti-corruption, and also as representing It's also remarkable to consider that at the beginning of the First World War, the Prussian state was effectively the largest employer in Europe. It was a managerial behemoth within Europe. So when we talk about, obviously in 1871, Germany is unified under the auspices of Prussia, and the King of Prussia, King Wilhelm, is made the first German emperor. So what happens really from 1871 until 1918, what isn't essentially subsumed into the rest of Germany, Prussia itself becomes identifiable by these institutions. This is where we get the idea of Prussian socialism. It is this veneration of the institutions, and it's the celebration of the fact that the Prussian state had a sense of duty to respond to the collective needs of the nation by appealing to things like social security and old age pensions, which a lot of people look back on with a great sense of nostalgia. And Prussian socialism, in this sense, was meant to be the opposition to ideological anti-nationalist socialism, i.e., a socialism which is wedded to a unique and particularistic conception of Prussian virtue. But again, that's very much the cliche, but it's something which was held essentially as sacrosanct at the time. So, for example, when we talk about Leopold von Ranke and the professionalization of history, it is the superlative institutions of the Prussian state, supposedly, that again represent the political as the driving force within history itself. If you look at history through the lens of Prussia, you can't help but look at the sort of arc of history, not through the development of the economy or the development of social institutions, but is of the finessing and the creation of enduring institutions. You can go back to an earlier precedent, this idea of cameralismus, chamber politics, the idea that there is a science of administration and it is the expansive managerial bureaucratic state which is supposed to be the exemplar of good government. And of course, Hegel, which you mentioned, the battles of Vienna and Auerstedt. Hegel, I believe, was teaching at the University of Vienna at that time, believed that Napoleon's ascent would result in the end of history itself, in the sense that it is the values of Napoleonic revolutionary France which are going to be imbued in the Prussian state, which will create the state exemplar in the reforms of Hardenberg and Stein in Prussia.
So is he the Francis Fukuyama of his time, in a sense?
Well, have you actually read The End of History?
I have not actually, no.
If you read The End of History, he begins by talking about the Battle of Vienna and the identification of Hegel. So yes,
he channels Hegel himself. Yeah, there you go.
Yes, as someone's mentioning, it is the quintessential Hegelian synthesis in the form of Prussia. So that is so as we can see on this map, the reason why I'm emphasizing, again, Wolfram's hagiography for Germany and the idea of, essentially the Allies and their imperialism being able to sacrifice these elements is because it is this idea of the army, as you mentioned, the dynasty, the Hohenzollern dynasty, and the veneration for the state and the institutions and the massive, again, bureaucratic superstructure that was Prussia, that is more important than the actual people and the actual territory itself, because the people are very much being subsumed into Germany. During the 1866 war, which Prussia won against Austria, it didn't gain any territories against Austria, but it did gain a huge amount of territories against the smaller states. In the Schleswig-Holstein War, Prussia conquered Holstein and Schleswig. You can see on this map in the north near Denmark, but it also annexed Hanover. And of course, from a political and strategic standpoint, it made a lot of sense to annex Hanover because it basically separated the Eastern Prussian territories from the Rhineland-Westphalian territories in the west. But this also meant that there was basically a hostile population contained within Prussia who were only there by force of arms, effectively the whole Hanoverian basis. And by extension, Prussia also annexed large parts of Hesse. It annexed Frankfurt deliberately because Frankfurt was seen as the vehicle, the capital of a would-be democratic Germany, as it had been in 1848 and 1849. So all of these territories, which are not related to the history of Prussia, but have an inbuilt hostility to Prussia. As you can see, this map has nothing compared to the sporadic little dynastic holdings and territories that we see here. This is part of the reason why the actual territorial identity of Prussia becomes subsumed into that of Germany itself. And it's no surprise that very early on in the comparative history of the Reich, the Prussians lose their monopoly over the position of Chancellor, which, as I need to remind you, was fused into the position of Prussian Minister-President. I believe it's Hohenlohe-Schillingfürst who takes the office of Chancellor after Leopold von Caprivi is ousted. So that is how Prussia is able to survive. And now we come to the idea towards the end of the First World War. The Prussian army and its morale breaks down between October and November of 1918. Officially, basically, the army will no longer serve the whims of the Kaiser, who is the supreme warlord and the commander-in-chief. And it is when we have Ludendorff's, who was by that time essentially the military director of Germany during the last 2 years of the war, is basically the chief of staff of the High Command, with Hindenburg serving in the more symbolic role. Ludendorff has a mental breakdown, and a few weeks later he's replaced by Groener. And Groener very candidly says to the Kaiser that in order to preserve the army and preserve Germany, we must dispense with the Kaiser, because the whole, again, I mentioned this idea of this coming about in 1947, but the reason I'm focusing specifically on the period between 1918 and 1947 is because it forms this nice demarcation point. We have Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, and his whole mantra of the 14 points and making the world safe for democracy. So part of the process of making the world safe for democracy is dispensing with the German Kaiser. The German army is prepared to jettison the German Kaiser for the sake of preserving the German army and for preserving some element of Prussia, which means that Prussia in and of itself needs to be reformed to appease, again, this, you can ultimately say, this liberal westernizing zeal that comes at the expense of this whole notion of a Prussian identity, which is the whole nucleus, the foundation of Prussia. Bear in mind that Prussia, the German unification under Prussia, was conceived of as basically being the extension of the army and of the dynasty, the Hohenzollern dynasty. Now the Hohenzollern dynasty has basically been jettisoned. Kaiser Wilhelm II goes to live in Dorn in the Netherlands, and this is something that many more hardcore Prussian aristocrats will never forgive. And the army attempts to hold on and wrestle in the situation. So already one key tenet of Prussian identity in the form of the Kaiser is gone. And what that means is that I mentioned the state evangelical church of Prussia. All of a sudden, that is headless. The Catholics, who have been organized under the time of Bismarck during the Kulturkampf, which is basically an attempt to depoliticize Catholics, and of course that very way went, spectacularly well, and actually created a consolidated political opposition with the backing of Pope Leo XIII in the form of the Centre Party. All of these elements meant that the whole basis of old Prussiandom was, you can say, not terminally weakened, but very much severely weakened as a result of the loss of the Kaiser. And very early on, we have this notion of, well, can the army survive the end of the First World War, and the dissolution of the Kaiserreich? And what is interesting about the formation of the Weimar Republic is it's very much a representation of political dualism. The army never officially sort of sublimates itself to civilian command. What the Kaiser represented within the old German imperial constitution was a third faction. You have the Reich institutions, the Chancellor, and the organizations which basically represent the smaller states. You have the Reichstag, you have the army, and you have the Kaiser. The Kaiser is the element that balances all of these forces together, because as much as
Literally
Bismarck,
the states of the realm.
well, I mean, it's even more complicated than that, because basically Bismarck created his position so he could dominate the institutions and the army.
Indeed.
And also sequester the monarch. So
Yes.
he has no authority. So the minute you have the loss
He
of
was the
Bismarck,
conduit between everything else and the Kaiser and vice versa.
yes, exactly. So the minute Bismarck goes, now all of a sudden you have all this institutional tension that exists in the heart of the whole Prussian situation, the Prussian constitution. So when the Kaiser goes, that anchor holding the entire system collapses. So what basically holds the Weimar Republic together within the first couple of years? It is the democratic socialists and the demobilized German army trying to hold things together to prevent the onslaught of communism. You have the Spartacist Revolution, you have the revolution of Kurt Eisner in Bavaria, and the pact between Ebert, who becomes the first president of Germany, and Groener, the chief of staff of the army, basically achieves this purpose, which is the Freikorps, the demilitarized units, the rump of the army, which is permitted after Versailles of some 100,000 men, will be there to dispense brutal justice against leftists and against revolutionaries, while the other more amenable socialist elements, such as the Democratic Socialist Party under Ebert, will be able to reform the Weimar system, the political system in Germany, in a gradualist manner. But as you can see, this friction between this temporary alliance between the army and the new post-Kaiserreich political forces is incredibly tenuous. It is the loss of the King of Prussia and his loss of the German emperor that means this entire system is basically thrown into chaos, a chaos which doesn't really recede until we get to 1924 after the introduction of the new currency and the withdrawal of French and Belgian troops from the Ruhr, and of course after the Munich Putsch. But how does Prussia feature onto all of this? Well, the Prussian army survived, but something miraculous happens. And miraculous, I mean, in terms of how Bismarck would have construed Prussian identity. As I mentioned, Prussia saw more so its identity less as being associated with a particular people or nation distinct from Germany, but as representing state institutions which were in many ways a German exemplar, something not just for Germans, but for the rest of the world to follow. But again, that was a distinct idea of Prussian socialism wedded to hierarchy. Within the Prussian constitution, you have a three-tier system of elections, and you also have the Herrenhaus, the German version of the House of Lords. What this means is that the Prussian constitution is actually far less, quote-unquote, democratic than the universal suffrage which has been afforded to the German people in the Reichstag. All of a sudden, the Kaiser is gone. These institutions can no longer defend themselves. And in 1919, Prussia is reconstituted. In fact, from a socialist point of view, you would have thought, Marcus, wouldn't you, that the whole existence of Prussia, based on these ideas of Wilson, these ideas which will later be reaffirmed by the Allies in Law 46, Prussia itself might be seen as a liability, an anachronism in the new Germany we're trying to create. And so what is wonderfully ironic about Prussia and why the Weimar Republic is a bit of a misnomer, because Weimar, of course, was a temporary capital which they escaped to. I think it was during the Kapp Putsch, and it was based in Saxe-Weimar. It wasn't based in Prussia. But the life of the Weimar Republic can basically be explained by the viability of the Free State of Prussia. It is the life and death of the Free State of Prussia that explains the fortunes of the Weimar Republic. And what do I mean by that? The reason the socialists came to accept Prussia as a necessity is because the vast territory of Prussia that you can see within Germany itself means that these territories aren't necessarily going to want to leave the German state, what's left of it. There was a huge Rhenish independence movement, ironically led by Konrad Adenauer, in the Western territories that would seem basically to form a vassal state under France. That was essentially the idea. So in preserving what was left of Prussia, what do the socialists do? They hold on to those territories and they form the basis of the new Weimar Republic and its territories here. Yet at the same time, conveniently for the socialists, what has happened in the East? All of these territories, these vast territories in the East, which have been held in Poland, have now been lost. Upper Silesia, West Prussia, Posen, all of these territories are lost to the Prussian state.
And the Polish corridor to the sea, of course.
And the Polish corridor to the sea,
yeah.
and the city of Danzig. What this means is that the whole conception of Prussia as the East Elbe, as representing this great Eastern behemoth with its aristocratic privileges and, post-serfdom, the prevalence of agriculture and a military aristocracy, the power balance has been shifted decisively in the favor of the West. It is in fact the desire to hold on to the German West that keeps Prussia alive in terms of this necessity within the Weimar Constitution. And from 1919 until 1932, it is democratic Prussia, which is held together under other figures, but most commonly Otto Braun, which is held together by a coalition of the socialists and the Catholics. So the forces which Bismarck had done everything in his power from 1871 until 1890 to crush, that was the coalition which held Prussia together during that time. And it was often remarked at that time that basically, whilst the Weimar Constitution was in chaos as governments collapsed, every year, sometimes, more frequently than that, Otto Braun and Prussia was a form of democratic stability. Otto Braun was referred to essentially as the Red Tsar of Prussia within this whole conception. I mean, just compare Bavaria, for example, talk about the Munich Putsch. The whole basis of the National Socialist stratagem in Bavaria was that Hitler was going to bring the political apparatus of Bavaria to bear on Berlin. Basically, Bavaria was going to be the nucleus of the national revolution. Prussia is held in contradistinction to that. Prussia is the great redoubt of the socialists, and it's the redoubt of the Catholic Centre Party. So Prussia, representing this idea of dualism, what Prussia ultimately represents in terms of the territory and in terms of the institutions, you latch on to this idea, basically, of expansive government, but now it is under the command of the Social Democratic Party, and it's under the command of Zentrum. It's also during this time that Prussia attempts to wheedle out the forces which are loyal to the monarchy. It attempts to wheedle out these elements of the Junker aristocracy and the prevalence of religion, and it does so through a series of gradualist reforms that would basically see a new crop of civil servants and judges who are loyal to social democracy, and they're loyal to this idea of the Weimar Constitution. However, the reason that this doesn't accelerate as perhaps you might imagine under a social democratic system which lasts for more than a decade is because the Centre Party are the ones who, again, enamored of this idea of the Prussian virtue within the secular government, and they don't want a wholesale purge, political purge of the institutions for the sake of eroding all of those quote-unquote Prussian values of the virtues associated with austerity and honesty and pragmatism within the civil service. So it is this bizarre combination of a inherited civil service and army from the Kaiserreich period, combined to a coalition of forces which you can say were openly hostile to the legacy of the Kaiser. And that is what constitutes the revolution in Prussia during this time. What do you have to say about that, Marcus?
No, interesting. And you're quite right. Sort of this idea that sort of certain political groups gravitate towards institutions to sort of keep their conception of the state intact, and how Prussia, prior to during World War One, and obviously prior, was sort of the bastion of the dynasty and of the army, and was sort of seen, or would have been seen as a sort of a very reactionary sort of thing. But then in the aftermath of the tumult of the early Weimar period, and throughout the Weimar Republic, certainly throughout the heydays of the SPD, it sort of became this sort of retrenched, what do you call, like a sort of like a bastion of power for the Catholic Zentrum Party, and for the Social Democrats and Socialists who were trying to sort of keep the Weimar dream alive. It was sort of on the strength of Prussian institutions that was possible, at least for a time. Because I mean, if we think about what happened to Germany in terms of the end of the war, the confiscation of territory, the imposition of the conditions of Versailles, the rapid demobilization of the German armed forces from its many millions of men under arms to its permitted number of 100,000 men. Meanwhile, various sort of quasi-independent Freikorps units are fighting in Bavaria, putting down the revolution by Kurt Eisner. They're fighting in Silesia. There's even Freikorps units fighting in Berlin, and indeed up in the Baltics, where they're sort of actively campaigning. They're sort of 1919 and 1920 was a very difficult time for Germany, and yet it is sort of on the back of these time-tested institutions that the new government, in essence, was able to actually weather the storm, at least for a time, certainly sort of throughout the majority of the 20s. Interesting contradiction.
Well, it is an interesting contradiction, but it's less of a contradiction if you look at Prussia in terms of this again, the irony is that the more Bismarck expanded into Germany itself, the more he was dooming the project of East Elba, the old Prussian ideal, which you've been mentioning, that originated in the 30 Years' War. The fact that he was able to hold it together was on the basis of loyalty to the dynasty, loyalty to the Protestant Confederation in the Lutheran state churches, Calvinists and Lutherans, and of course the strength of the army. So now that the chancellorship has basically become a joke during the early Weimar period, the fact that the army has basically become, the rear guard of, anti sort of socialism, but also demobilized, and you have the prevalence of paramilitaries all throughout Germany. The forces that Bismarck desperately tried, and I believe massively sort of emboldened in a way and radicalized, because of course the ultimate trajectory of his attack on socialists was the denaturalization laws. Not only was the SDP banned, but he tried to deny socialist German citizenship. These forces come back 20 years after his death with a complete vengeance, and they are the forces that are able to seize control of the Prussian rump, from the forces which had so delicately held the old hierarchical Prussian ideal in check. But nevertheless, like I said, with the whole pervasiveness of the old Prussian civil service and the fact that the army is basically held in this alliance with the Weimar government, this is not to say that Otto Braun's authority was unquestioned. Basically, from a democratic point of view and parliamentary point of view, they held the majority. And of course, Prussia didn't have a head of state either. So Prussia was, in a sense, more radically democratic than the Weimar Constitution, because the Weimar Constitution allowed for a strong presidency, which in many ways was the successor to the empire. But in Prussia, there was no such situation. So Prussia had something that, again, Bismarck despised, which is a government by parliament and by a parliamentary majority.
Yes, and institutions which the SPD obviously became custodians of, and therefore those strong institutions ended up being a bastion for the SPD, much to the posthumous disgust of Bismarck, I'm sure.
But the army, of course, survives, and in 1925, von Hindenburg comes into power. In 1929, of course, Hindenburg was the de facto leader of the German war effort in the last 2 years. He had been the victor of Tannenberg. And again, all of this is to basically demonstrate the domineering presence of the Prussian archetype. There is no sort of greater exemplar of the Prussian archetype than Hindenburg. And of course, Hindenburg's vanity knew no bounds. He absolutely played up this stereotype to the point, again, he had in many ways eclipsed the Kaiser towards the end of the war, which is why, in a sense, that Hindenburg didn't go. He remained on the German political scene while the Kaiser fled and went to Dawn. So Hindenburg...
sorry, just to say, just in essence, throughout 1917-18, you could almost say that Germany was functionally under military dictatorship, headed by Ludendorff and Hindenburg.
Yes,
for all intents and purposes.
Yes, the supreme command. The minute Bettmann Hollweg leaves, effectively Germany is a military dictatorship under Ludendorff and Hindenburg, and they use that time to, like they would probably assume, like Scharnhorst or Gneisenau or Clausewitz, to bring all of the resources of Germany to bear in terms of the war effort and fight final victory. Again, trying to emphasize this continuity between the Prussian stereotypes and the wars that they fought before. But these elements, these soldierly elements, still persist within this period. And in 1929, there was the Great Depression, and this causes a economic as well as a political paralysis within Germany. And from 1930 onwards, Hindenburg effectively directly assumes control of the state by appointing several technocratic and Prussian soldier prime ministers. The first of them is Heinrich Brüning. Brüning is held in power until, again, the residue of Prussia and the old Prussia resurfacing, until Heinrich Brüning has a plan to deal with unemployment, which is to introduce land redistribution in the remnant of Prussia. Of course, Hindenburg takes that as well, as you can probably assume, and sacks Heinrich Brüning. That is basically the catalyst for him being dismissed in 1932. And then you have the rise of two Prussians of a different stripe. One is Franz von Papen. Papen is actually a Westphalian Catholic in terms of representing the many diffuse elements within Prussia itself, and the other is Kurt von Schleicher. But the ironic thing about all of this is that throughout this entire time, 1928 until 1932, you have the endurance of Otto Braun and Prussia, because Prussia isn't as stable as the rest of the Weimar Constitution. But in 1932, in the Prussian elections, the National Socialists do very well. They force the SDP and the Centre Party out of formal majority rule. But they aren't large enough, the National Socialists and the DNVP, to win a majority. It should also be noted that I mentioned these other sort of residual forces. A very large political force in Germany during the 1920s was the DNVP, the German National People's Party. The German National People's Party was effectively a loose coalition of people who were broadly sympathetic to the legacy of the Kaiserreich, from people who were more conservative adherents within the Weimar framework to people who actively wanted the Hohenzollerns to come back into power. But during the late 1920s and early 1930s, the dynamism is towards the Prussian towards the National Socialist model, to the extent that one of the princes, one of the sons of Wilhelm II, I believe it was August Wilhelm, becomes a member of the Nazi Party. Many members of the Prussian aristocracy and even the Hohenzollern dynasty become members of the Nazi Party, and they do very well in the 1932 elections. And this creates a constitutional crisis for Prussia, because there is no mechanism for allowing basically a government to reform, even if it doesn't win a majority. So Otto Braun limps on from that power with a minority government. There isn't any decisive change within Prussia. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, Prussia represents the viability of the Weimar situation. Prussia is that democratic bastion, ironically. It is the force of all the force. It is the epitome of all the forces that Bismarck tried to bring under his auspices and ultimately failed to do. But it is this democratic paralysis in the year 1932 that gives Hindenburg and it gives Franz von Papen the excuse they need to bring Prussia back under the control of the soldiers. You can say the Soldatenstaat, the old Prussian aristocracy. So ironically, the forces who are behind the dissolution of the Prussian Free State during the Preußenschlag, the Prussian coup d'état of 1932, are Prussians: Hindenburg, Papen, and ultimately Schleicher. Papen creates Prussia as a Reichskommissariat, part of the nomenclature that's going to be used, extensively by the National Socialists. And it's also this which is, you can say, a fundamental building block in what would later be used by Goering to assume complete command of Germany from the 1933 onwards. So that, in a sense, the Preußenschlag represents this, again, dualistic nature of Prussia. You have these ascendant forces in the form of the Catholics and the Socialists, and now you have the Prussian soldierly elements of the old class order coming back with a vengeance and having to destroy the institution of the Free State in order to reform it as the Reichskommissariat. When you have the original cabinet of Hitler, Hitler is brought in as a result of the initiative of Franz von Papen. First of all, Hindenburg tries to bring a soldier in, von Schleicher. Von Schleicher is unable to hold a government together, and so Franz von Papen convinces Hindenburg that we can form a coalition around the National Socialists, who are by far the largest party in Germany at this time, but don't have a majority. We can bring in members from the DNVP, we can bring in Prussians, we can bring in old conservatives of the Kaiserreich model. And Hitler can basically be completely quarantined within that whole political system. What allowance that Franz von Papen doesn't make as the new Vice Chancellor of Germany is the fact that Hitler awards Hermann Goering the position of Minister of Portfolio and Reichskommissar of Prussia, which isn't included within the official cabinet position. And it is through that position that Hermann Goering becomes instrumental in utilizing the Prussian civil service, specifically the Prussian police force, that later become the nucleus of elements such as the Gestapo, which allow for the consolidation of power within German National Socialist hands using the machinery, the coercive machinery of what is left of the Prussian state.
It's worth mentioning that the Prussian police force itself was a larger law enforcement, I hate to use the word agency, but was the largest law enforcement body in Germany vis-a-vis the rest of Germany combined. So it actually gave Goering an inordinate amount of power in which for the National Socialists to sort of bring about their control of government post 33. You're quite right in saying that Goering was instrumental in that process.
But it's interesting again to consider, because I'm sure a lot of people don't really even think about Prussia from a cursory point of view after the flight of the Kaiser and after the defeat of World War One. But you can't understand the rise and fall of the Weimar Republic without understanding the position of Prussia within it. The position of Prussia
It's fundamental.
is fundamentally integral to this. But also, as I mentioned, the irony of the Free State being the antithesis of the old Prussia envisaged by Bismarck, the old Prussian forces coming back to dissolve the Free State of Prussia, and then Goering takes that mantra and basically allows for the completion, essentially, of not the abolition of the institutions of Prussia, but nevertheless they are sublimated to a new conception of what it means to rule over Germany. Hitler, when he assumes power, first of all, as Chancellor, we have the Reichstag fire in the beginning of 1933, and after I think it's just before the Enabling Act is passed, we have the Day of Potsdam. At the Day of Potsdam, of course, Potsdam is the equivalent of the Prussian Versailles. It is held outside the Garrison Church. There is a symbolic event whereby Hindenburg basically invests Hitler with the power to deal with the communists after the burning of the Reichstag power. And this is a few months, I believe, before the passage of the Enabling Act. Hindenburg is there, and you also have the presence of the Crown Prince of Germany and various other members of the Prussian dynasty, of the Prussian royal family and the Prussian aristocracy. And even though the Day of Potsdam was basically just a propaganda event to allow for some continuity between Prussiandom, the old Prussian, grandees and the state, and the new National Socialist regime, that is very much used as a symbolic exercise in terms of the demonization of Prussia. Even though, as you can see in this map, Hitler had no need for to retain the institutions of Prussia once he had control over the coercive apparatus of the Prussian state through the use of the police, because Hitler, what's the word I'm looking for, plasters the old Prussian territory with the Reichsgau, which are held by party officials which are directly appointed by Hitler. Basically, the Länder are reduced within the whole structure of Germany. Hitler, of course, is an anti-federalist. He believes in a unitary Germany and also a radically new conception of what it means to be German, the Heimensreich, the unification of all of the ethnic Germans within the territory, and the introduction of Austrian possessions, German possessions, as a result of the Anschluss and later the Sudeten crisis. And you can say that in terms of identifying the actual sort of legacy of Prussia and how it, other than a propaganda sense, other than a legendary sense, doesn't actually feature that strongly within the National Socialist government, is the fact that, as you know, Marcus, what is the sort of last great territory that Hitler decides to reintegrate back into the Reich? It is the Polish territories. It is Danzig. It is the corridor. It is Posen. Yes. Hitler goes out of his way to basically ignore the desires of the DNVP to restore the German colonies. Eupen, for example, which had also been lost in the West, is permanently lost to Belgium.
And Malmedy, yeah.
Yes, and Schleswig, also in the north, a former Prussian territory. Hitler doesn't even annex it when Denmark is occupied during the course of the war from 1940 onwards. So you can say that, again, the over-indexing of Austrians and Bavarians within the whole structure of the National Socialist government explains, you can say, the southward trajectory and push right from 1934 with the first failed Anschluss attempt versus the more traditional Prussian-centered focus foreign policy, which was explicitly referenced in terms of the reannexation of the old territories of Prussia. Instead, Hitler pursues a new course when it comes to foreign policy, and it's only by 1939 that the restitution of Prussian territories becomes a key sticking point. And it should be noted, not the restitution of all Prussian territories either. Hitler's original negotiation point from 1939 onwards is the restoration of the corridor and Danzig. It is not the restitution of all Prussian territories, which is even more interesting to consider.
Although there is something that jumped out at me looking at this map here, because obviously this is a map from 44, the beginning of 1944 here, and you can tell from top of the pitch there, is that if you see the territory of East Prussia here and what they call Vaterland, which is sort of that intermediary territory between what was East and West Prussia, and then sort of that bulge between it and Silesia, is that this this sort of outer perimeter of, let's call it Großdeutschland, Greater Germany, because east of that you have the general government and the Reichskommissariat to the east, is that this border is almost more reminiscent of that borderland pre-Napoleon Prussia in a strange way. I'm not saying that it was the intention of the government, but it's sort of a very strange irony. If you can maybe click back to that pre-Napoleon map of the kingdom pre-1806, you see what I'm alluding to here? Like that eastern frontier looks kind of similar. And it's interesting that in trying to break away from Prussianism, he sort of reinstitutes a border, a demarcation line that is very, very similar. It's just one of the strange ironies I picked up on.
I think it's important to understand where the ideological lens is in terms of understanding Hitler's project for expansion, which is it is not built upon the restoration of Prussia. Like I said, that was really the goal of the grandees, the DNVP. Rather,
but a Germany for all Germans,
Well, even sort of greater than that. A very early influence on Hitler was Alfred Rosenberg, who would later become the Reichskommissar of the occupied territories. Alfred Rosenberg was a Baltic German, and it is very clear from as early as sort of 1921 onwards that there is a conception of the Germans in the East. It is very much wedded to an older idea than the existence of secularized Prussia, which is of that of what I mentioned earlier in the stream with deliberate intent, which is the prevalence of the Aussiedlung. Basically, what Hitler envisions in terms of the eastward expansion is not just the unification of all of the German peoples in the East, from the Baltic states to the great sort of postmodern historical restoration of the Gothic populations in Theodoric, Schaffhaven, or the restitution with the Volga Germans or what have you. But it is far more again focused on medievalism. It is, we are going to achieve the grander Aussiedlung against the Slavs, which was only sort of minorly successful in establishing the terra marina, the German Baltic supremacy over the Baltic states, etc. So yes, it just so happens to coincide with Prussian expansionism, but it's definitely the case that Hitler had no desire to expand Prussia at the expense of Germany. He was very much interested in using Prussian gains to expand Germany, not vice versa, if that makes sense.
Indeed, absolutely.
So
important distinction, by the way.
So that's a very important distinction in terms of Prussia being submerged and plastered over by the new creation of the Reichsgau. But this, again, is a very important discussion because it pertains to the whole idea of the execution of Prussia. Because the way that we're describing it, the way that we have the old Prussia, Prussian socialism, the Prussian military hierarchy, the Hohenzollern dynasty, and the fact that that was eroded and then reconstituted in 1919 with the democratic bastion of Prussia, and then Prussia was fundamentally dissolved with the Reichskommissariat in 1932 during the Preußen Schlag. That would all indicate, wouldn't it, that Prussia was actually the last holdout of democracy. So why is it 15 years later we're getting Law 46 and the admonition of Prussia as this, redoubt of militarism, which would seem to actually be ahistorical? And again, it's because of this association with Prussian-dom, so to speak, because there are two elements of Prussia here. One, which is congruent with the aims of National Socialism, and one which is basically the antithesis. The aims which are congruent with National Socialism are what you've already alluded to, Marcus, which is this idea of the nation at arms struggling against all the odds, the nation focusing on famine, economic deprivations, and a war of all against all on all sides.
Courage, austerity, etc., etc.
Yes, exactly. And it is the example of the continued sacrifice that feeds into Goebbels' idea of the total war after the loss of Stalingrad in 1943.
The Totalenkrieg speech of early 43,
Yes, exactly. All of this is to say that there is a mythology, a cultural mythology, which is built around Prussia, which is very much the exponent of Goebbels himself. Goebbels, by the way, was technically a Prussian, even though, again, he came from the Rhineland. I believe he came from Cologne, but nevertheless, he was technically a Prussian. And his whole focus, again, was to identify the cause of the Reich and the cause of the Führer with the legacy of Frederick the Great. There was a film of Frederick the Great which was produced by UFA, which was basically trying to describe Frederick the Great as some sort of precursor to Hitler in this regard, in terms of the struggle again against all the powers surrounding, against Russia in particular, it must be noted. But there is so it is that element essentially which Goebbels holds on to. And Hitler earnestly believed this as well. He earnestly believed he was in many ways the reincarnation of Frederick the Great. Famously, the only portrait he had in the Führer bunker during the last days was of Frederick the Great. And what would Goebbels do to steel Hitler's resolve in the last days? He would read Thomas Carlyle's history of Frederick the Great, which, again, the issue with Carlyle as a historian is that he's as much a hagiographer and a poet in the vein of Schiller as he is an objective historian. So his is really a dramatic reenactment of what should have happened during the 7 Years' War, rather than the conventional history, which, again, we're talking about. Weirdly enough, again, Carlyle is this Schillerian exponent in terms of the post-Scottish Romantic Enlightenment and all those weird things, but of course it rebounds and has this dramatic effect on German identity, and in terms of the own identification of Goebbels and Hitler, specifically with the cause of Frederick the Great. And of course, when Roosevelt dies 10 days before Hitler commits suicide, what does Goebbels do?
Trying to think specifically.
He runs to tell Hitler that we have our miracle of Brandenburg.
Oh, the death of Roosevelt, right? Yes.
Yes, the death of Frederick Delano Roosevelt. Now
Yes.
the key instigator of the war is dead. We shall have our peace, and Germany is saved. So it is.
Which, sorry, just very briefly, and that sort of plays in also to some degree with the gambit in the West as well. The Operation Wack am Rhein. We're going to capture Antwerp. We'll separate the British from the Americans. We'll bargain a separate peace in the West, and we'll throw everything eastwards. And the death of Roosevelt at that time plays, or I mean, it was a bit afterwards, but it plays into that desperation which was sort of occurring at that point in time, like lurching towards some kind of historical precedent, would you say? At least to a point.
Yes, I mean, in terms of operations, I mean, what was the operation for the final defense of Berlin? It was Operation Clausewitz. So
That's right,
yes,
yes.
there are many things you can draw in terms of this explicit association, but that is part of the story. Then there is the anti Hitler, the anti-National Socialist part of the story, which is the endurance of the Prussian nobility who are fundamentally hostile to Hitler. As I mentioned, Franz von Papen was instrumental in terms of being able to convince Hindenburg to bring Hitler into power. Hindenburg dies in 1934, and Hitler amalgamates the position of Chancellor with that of President to create the new position, essentially, of sanctified head of state Führer. But all of this
Which
is to
becomes
say,
essentially Reichsführer, essentially, right?
well, Reichsführer is a position which is handed out to Heinrich Himmler to make this.
Oh, no, I'm just trying to think. Is it because the two positions sort of amalgamated, and then he becomes a Führer. I've just lost my train of thought. But yes.
But anyway,
Sorry, details.
as I mentioned, with Ebert and Gruner, there was a understanding between the Weimar Constitution and the army, what was left of it, that there shall be a parity between the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
When Hitler comes to power off the back of the Night of Long Knives, which, again, it should be important to point out, assassinates Kurt von Schleicher. Von Schleicher is very much the head of the militant wing of the Prussian, residue against Hitler, and so he is conveniently bumped off while, Franz von Papen is simply demoted. But when that happens, the army swears an oath of loyalty to Hitler. I mentioned with the loss of the Kaiser that there was a position within the German constitution which was lost, which can help explain basically the paralysis of much of the early constitution within Germany, within Weimar. But when Hitler assumes that power, he is basically recreating the position of supreme warlord. He is recreating the position of the old Kaiser in some sense. And he's also therefore recreating that allegiance with the army. The army shall swear allegiance to him personally, but he won't go out of his way to revolutionize the army, to continue the Brown Revolution by following the Ernst Röhm model of sublimating the army to the SA and making the Sturmabteilungen the new army of a revolutionary socialist Germany. So Hitler is prepared, like the Ebert Groener Pack, to take the remnants of the German army, which was effectively the Prussian army, and add them.
And at that time, the Reichswehr, as it was called,
and basically the Reichswehr, which would later become the Wehrmacht, compare those forces and basically add them as an ornament to his new regime. And this you can say, what's the best word to describe it? Again, another form of dualism exists with Blomberg, who of course is, infamously implicated in a scandal where he marries a former prostitute, and I think he's dismissed from power in 1938. But nevertheless,
I was going to say, is that the Bromberg-Frisch's affair from 37?
Yes, I think so. 37 or 38. Sorry.
37,
but so that's an element of it. Hitler has to show some deference to the army. He's made an alliance with the army in order to basically continue on in power. And again, the friction between these factions is represented in the fact that you now have the creation of the Kreisau Circle. You have a group of anti-national socialists. It should also be noted that many Prussian Catholics are also completely hostile to National Socialism. And you have the elements in the army itself, in particular Witzleben and Beck. And even the Kreisau Circle is in the House of Moltke. It should also be mentioned, not the famous Moltke Senior or Moltke Junior, but another Moltke. And right from 1938, there are plans afoot to depose Hitler and install a military dictatorship. So this relationship, as you can see, the Prussian elements are the most critical in terms of understanding the resistant movement to Hitler. And this relationship culminates in 1944, when you have the 20th of July plot against Hitler, which, like I said, is led by large elements within the German conservative, Christian, Protestant, Catholic, anti-National Socialist circles, and also within the army. And what this process allows, basically, is the acceleration of the loss of the army's independence from the party, the promotion of people, I believe, who was the infamous German general in charge of the Courland pocket.
Oh gosh, give me a sec. But go on. Yeah, I'll get to it in a sec.
Yes, and this again forms the idea of the Führer selection principle, which is during the course of the war, the elements which are there to be conducive to victory will come to the fore. One of the exemplars of this, from the point of view of Adolf Hitler, Schorner, apparently in the chat.
I was going to say Schorner or Rendulic. I couldn't remember which one, but
yes, Schorner, I believe, was the last head of the army when the will was created. So yes, Schorner was promoted. Rommel was seen as this example of a new sort of middle-class general, not of the old Prussian aristocratic mold, despite the fact, again, he was implicated in the plot of 1944.
And also a man with immense public popularity by this stage of the war.
Yes, exactly. And Hitler was content to allow for the rise of people outside of the Prussian aristocratic mold. But which
is why he favoured Rommel early, like in a pre-43, for that reason. Yeah.
But by the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945, the independence and the strength of the old Prussian elite had basically been broken. Many of the old, again, Christian monarchist, DNVP, anti-national socialist holdouts had been crushed. Many of them had been forced to appear before, what's his name? The head of the People's Court in Germany, Freisler. And have all their dignity stripped away from them.
Roland Freisler,
Roland Freisler, and then be sentenced to be garroted. So you have that. You have like I said, the suppression of the institution of the Prussian Lander, the Prussian state under the Reichsgau. You have the elimination of a independent element within the army, which had basically been continuing on from about 1938 onwards until it accelerates in 1942, when Hitler dismisses Brautisch as the head of the army and assumes direct command himself. And from 1944, this whole process towards the subordination of the military elements, and of course, combined to that, you also have the rise of the Waffen-SS and Heinrich Himmler basically representing a castle unto himself in terms of ability, again, like Ernst Röhm, ultimately, to replace the army with the forces of the SS in the long term had Germany won the war. But this is to say that that element is now gone of old Prussia. But now you have the actual territory and the people which are being peeled away. Towards 1944, the Soviets reach the border of East Prussia, and this begins a large-scale rout of the German population, inspired also by Goebbels' propaganda that there is going to be a wholesale slaughter and rape, and of course the elements of that are completely true, especially when it comes to the rape of the German population. But the Prussian population retreat far into the west, effectively, and they effectively become later subsumed into West Germany. Very few of them are prepared to accept, occupation by the East German sector under the Soviets. So during the course of the war, there is a flight of the German population. And after 1945, as you can see on this map in particular, the territory which mostly corresponds to this original map here, almost directly analogous with the exception of Brandenburg, is partitioned. It is lost to Germany forever, and East Prussia itself is partitioned into Kaliningrad and also into Poland. The remainder of the population,
and I was going to say the northern part into Lithuania too. Memel
yes,
is
Memel,
conceded to Lithuania,
which was part of the Soviet Union then, the
Correct.
Lithuanian
Yeah.
Soviet Socialist Republic.
Indeed.
But this is all to say that we're talking about the loss of state institutions and independence. We're talking about the usurpation of an ideal of Prussiandom towards a regime which is actively hostile towards the actual people and the remnants. And now you have the formal displacement and cleansing of those territories.
And in many cases, the murder of them as well.
Yes, we're talking about.
We can't underestimate the scale of this tragedy because it is.
We're talking about the
one.
loss of around 10 million people from these territories, 10 million Germans who then flee into West Germany, those who survive. So in terms of, again, the extermination of Prussia, we talk about the execution of Prussia because that's a formal indictment against Prussia's history. In the original order, we talk about the de facto end of Prussia, and that is because East Elbe, the core of this original conception of Prussia, is basically dead before we even come to the Allied declaration of the abolition of Prussia. But now it's at this point that I want to bring in the Allied arguments pertaining to the abolition of Prussia. And Marcus has already brought this up, but I'm reading a segment from Christopher Clark's book on the Iron Kingdom of Prussia. And just before I come to this reading segment, Marcus, is there anything you wanted to bring up?
No, I think we've more or less covered most bases. What I will just say, just because you actually have this particular map up on the right-hand side here, that sort of outlines the provinces which were sort of cleaved off Germany. You have East Prussia, West Prussia, Posen, Silesia, essentially Ostbrandenburg, or the Ostmark as it was called, or the Neumark once upon a time, and Pomerania. And funny enough is that Görlitz, which is in the south, is split in two because that straddles the Oder-Neisse River, and then up in the north, Stettin is technically on the west bank, but they still decide to give Stettin to Poland in the post-war settlement. But there was actually a negotiation throughout 45 and I think into 46, actually to determine this eastern borderland. I think it was called the Curzon Line, and there was actually proposals for parts of Silesia and the very western extremity of Pomerania to remain as a part of Germany. I think there was quite a convincing case that particularly I think the British favoured sort of northern Silesia, sort of with a core around Breslau, to be maintained as a part of eastern Germany. But as we know from the way the lines ended up being drawn in our present day reality, that did not come to pass. I just don't know if you had that slide lined up, but it was just worth mentioning.
Well, I mean, the Curzon Line was something which was drawn up during the original Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920, which was the basis of Stalin saying, well, this is the western boundary of the Soviet Union, which included eastern Poland. And, this was agreed back in 1919. You can't possibly deny us that. But the reason these territories were awarded was not just the fact that Prussia itself was being eviscerated in the process, but it was also the point that these territories were given to Poland as compensation for the Soviets annexing the rest.
For the loss of the Kresy territories in the east,
Yes.
of what was formerly Eastern Poland, of course. Yeah,
Yes,
the
exactly.
territories around like Vilno and Lviv, etc. Yeah.
And there's another cynical reading of it, which is the more territories that Poland acquires, the more Russia can demand from its third of occupied Germany, effectively.
Yes, indeed.
So this is the segment taken from Christopher Clark. In the end, it was the Nazi view of Prussia that prevailed. The Western Allies needed no persuading that Nazism was merely the latest manifestation of Prussianism. They could draw on an intellectually formidable tradition of anti-Prussianism that dated back to the outbreak of the First World War. In August of 1914, Ramsay Moore, a distinguished liberal activist and holder of the chair of modern history at the University of Manchester, published a widely read study that claimed to examine the historical background of the current conflict. It is the result, Moore wrote, of a poison which has been working in the European system for more than 2 centuries, and the chief source of that poison is Prussia. In another study published early in the war, the First World War, William Herbert Dawson, a social liberal publicist and one of the most influential commentators on German history and politics in the early 20th century Britain, pointed to the militarizing influence of the Prussian spirit within the otherwise benign German nation. The spirit has ever been a hard and immalleable element in the life of Germany. It is still the knot in the oak, the nodule in the softer clay. Well, so you can understand that the motivation behind this, obviously there was a historical antipathy going about this, for a very long time. But why are these arguments always being incentivized? Because Germany is at war with Great Britain. And also we talk about the first idea of Prussia in its original manifestation as the old imperial, the alliance between the scepter and the sword, basically the king and the army, how in order to again fight a total war against Germany, one needed to dismantle the German state and basically teach the Hun a lesson for daring to challenge the British in terms of their naval hegemony within the North Sea. And of course, this whole notion of Prussian militarism, it actually predates even the First World War. I mean, Winston Churchill would basically use it as part of his own sort of casus belli in terms of inciting war against Germany, or not inciting war against Germany, but justifying it post hoc when we have the annexation of Belgium. Indeed, Belgium and the idea of the atrocities of the German army, the rampant excesses, etc., it all feeds into this mindset very early on, 33 years before the dissolution, that Prussia is a unique menace. And, I mean, this perhaps goes back to the Hun speech, which was given in the reference to the context of the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, this identification with Germany and the Eastern barbaric hordes visiting some sort of migration era invasion of Europe as representing some sort of facsimile of the old Roman Empire, etc. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, to an extent. Although I sort of do feel sorry for the Germans insofar that, like, obviously they were referencing, people to the east of them with the Hun speech, and yet somehow the British interpretation was to call the Germans Huns. I sort of find that chuckle worthy. But yes, indeed, I tend to follow your train of thought there.
Common to many analysis was the notion that there were in fact 2 Germanys: the liberal, congenial, and Pacific Germany of the South and West, the reaction militaristic Germany of the Northeast. So again, when they're talking about the militaristic Germany, they're separating East Elba from the heartlands of the socialists and the Centre Party in the West, in what is now Rhineland, Rhineland-Westphalia, and they're also separating it from Bavaria and from Württemberg. The tensions between the two, it was argued, remain unresolved within the empire founded by Bismarck in 1871. The historical tensions, I mean, like I said, there was genuine desire for nations like Bavaria to integrate with the Prussian economy, and Prussia could also guarantee Bavaria some element of its territorial integrity, which Napoleon III was not prepared to grant with his demand of the Palatinate. So yes, I mean, obviously the tension is brought in the fact that it represents Prussian hegemony within the rest of Germany, not a complete union in the sense that Hitler would try and affect. Essentially, if you look at the First Reich as the Holy Roman Empire, these diffused, decentralized elements. The Second Reich under Prussia is there basically to paper over the limitations of decentralization, which in the Schillerian mindset are responsible for the massive foreign interventions within Germany that culminate in the mediatizations. Then, from that point of view, Prussia is there to defend the principle of monarchical governments in the south and in other parts of Germany under the banner and the aegis of the Prussian army. Hitler takes it a step further in continuing the democratic revolution, the Brown Revolution, that results in the equalization of all parts of Germany and the unification of all parts of Germany. You can say it's part of an accelerated process, but Prussia represents this middle way, essentially, between the two, the defense of the German nation, but also hegemony under one particular Prussian state and one particular Prussian monarchy. One of the most sophisticated and influential early analysis of this problem was the American sociologist Thorstein Veblen. In a study of German industrial society published in 1915 and reissued in 1939, obviously, I think, in result of the war, Veblen argued that a lopsided process of modernization had distorted German political culture. Modernism had transformed the sphere of industrial organization, but had failed to effect an equally secure and disturbing lodgment in the tissues of body politic. The reason for this, Veblen diagnosed, lay in the survival of an essentially pre-modern Prussian territorial state. The history of this state, he suggested, amounted to a career of more or less uninterrupted aggressive war-making. Just to emphasize that, because again, that point is something which is brought up again and again in arguments made around and after World War One. Prussia barely went to war in the 18th century. Yeah, we focus on the War of Austrian Succession, in which Prussia annexed Silesia, and we talk about the War of the 7 Years' War, which was in some ways a defensive war, rather a preemptive defensive war. And then Frederick the Great fought no wars after that, whereas Russia was continually fighting, say, for example, against the Ottomans and expanding into the east. Britain was expanding into India after the Battle of Plassey and the conquest of Clive, was embroiled in the American Revolutionary Wars, and then, of course, we have Napoleonic France. So this idea that Prussia is uniquely militaristic is just historically verifiably untrue. There's no way of basically pointing to that. The example you can bring in to counter that is, of course, the cluster of wars between 1864 and 1871. But then again, that was followed by a very long period of peace until 1914, in which Bismarck and Germany tried to proceed and place themselves as the honest broker of the continent. So that again is very much a argument which is taken in the context of World War One and then retroactively outfitted to the entire course of Prussian history.
Exactly, you're sort of applying this false lens on the immediate past, because the other point is too is, like, technically speaking, I mean, although a fair-minded person would accept the fact that France was goaded into war, but I mean, Napoleon III and the French government didn't actually have to declare war in Germany in 1971, but it chose to engage in a war with them, and in essence provided the North German Confederation with a galvanizing force with which to fight under a united banner. So one could even argue that the Franco-Prussian War, although provoked by Germany through their diplomatic actions with, Prince Leopold and the Spanish crown, they did not declare war. It was the French. So there's that to add to that as well.
Well, I also think that Napoleon III does have a great deal of culpability because he was an expansionist.
Indeed.
And like I said, he wanted the left bank of the Rhine. He was an expansionist into Italy. Like I said, the Italian wars of unification wouldn't have really been possible under the auspices of the Kingdom of Savoy, had it not, Sardinia, Piedmont, had it not been for Napoleon III. And also the reason Napoleon III, didn't get involved in war with Prussia earlier, Imperator for what's actually false. So there's an element to that, but in 1866, Napoleon III perhaps should have intervened in that war on the side of Austria and formed an alliance that then resulted in the partition of Prussia from Silesia given back to Austria and then the Rhineland given back to France. But he didn't, because he was betting on there being a long war, and then France can extract concessions without having to do anything. That proved to be a massive mistake. So, like I said, Napoleon III had an incredibly bellicose foreign policy re Europe. There was perhaps an inevitable conflict between Germany and France based on the aspirations of empire and Napoleon III. And like I said, he even tried to annex Luxembourg and failed. And there were plans, for example, of him annexing Belgium. So no, it's not fair to. I mean, basically, you can look at Bismarck and Napoleon III and say they roughly had the same plan, except one was better than the other.
Well, what's actually interesting too is that, you know, I suppose I say this with my admitted partial Italian bias, right? Is that if you look at the difference between French and Prussian involvement in Austrian affairs and fighting a unified war against the Austrians, is that when, for instance, Napoleon III agreed to support the House of Vittorio Emanuele, the House of Savoy, in their independence and unification wars in Italy, Napoleon III essentially demanded concessions. And this is where, funnily enough, despite it being called the Kingdom of Piedmont and Savoy, they were essentially made to concede Savoia, the Savoyard part of Piedmont, to France, and also as a part of that, the city of modern day city of Nice, which the Italians called Nizza, and in essence also the hegemony over Monaco, Monte Carlo, although technically an independent state as it was then. Whereas and that sort of coincided with the Battle of Solferino and the Second Italian War against the Austrian Empire. Whereas in the Third War of Independence, actually basically coincided with the Prussian-Austrian War of 1866. The Prussians made no demands of the Italians, and the Italians acquired the territory of Veneto at no cost. So just like as an interesting sort of comparison between the two powers and their dealings with, you know, potential allies in conflicts against the Austrians, I just thought that's always been an interesting comparison in my mind.
Someone in the chat, this isn't a time to talk about the end of the Roman Empire. Thank you. Move on to topics which are more pertinent. Right. The history of this state, he suggested, amounted to a career of more or less uninterrupted aggressive war making. The consequence was a political culture of extreme civility for the pursuit of war, being an exercise in the following of one's leader and execution of arbitrary orders, induces an animus of enthusiastic subservience and unquestioning obedience to authority. In such a system, the loyal support of popular sentiment could be maintained only by unremitting habituation and discipline, sagaciously and relentlessly directed to this end, by a system of bureaucratic surveillance and unremittent interference in the private life of subjects. So all of Prussianism basically tends towards totalitarianism, according to that view. And of course, this is not just an indictment upon the regime of National Socialism, but it's harkening back again to the experience of the Supreme Command during the First World War, and turning the whole legacy you brought up again, basically on the defense of the state around a leader figure, whether it be Bismarck or whether it be Frederick II, is basically recontextualized as basically blindly following military whim to whatever end. So you can say, like I said, it's taking the most unfavorable interpretation of that. And of course, this is the whole basis of the vilification of the specific sense of German history that happened to be this state militarized Prussia and the victory of Prussian arms, which was responsible for the unification, hence why it needed to be extricated and ultimately abolished. Veblen's account was light on empirical data and supporting evidence, but it was not without theoretical sophistication. It aimed not only to describe, but also to explain the supposed deformations of Prussian German political culture. Like I said, this is all consistent in terms of a certain ideological lens. It was supported, moreover, by an implicit conception of the modern, in the light of which Prussia could be deemed archaic, anachronistic, only partially modernized. And again, this incredibly dubious and subjective notion of modernization based on the example of the West. It is striking how much of the substance of the special path thesis, Sonderweg, that would rise to prominence in German historical writings in the 1960s and 70s already anticipated in Veblen's account. There was no accident in Ralph Davenhoff, whose Synoptic Studies, Society and Democratic Germany, was one of the foundational texts of the critical school, i.e. the Frankfurt School, drew heavily on the work of the American sociologist. Even the rather cruder accounts that passed for historical analysis of modern Germany during the Second World War often preserved a sense of historical perspective, rather than settling for generalizations about German national character. Since the 17th century, one writer observed in 41, the old German spirit of conquest had been deliberately developed more and along the lines of the mentality that is known as Prussianism. The history of Prussia had been an almost uninterrupted period of forcible expansion under the iron rule of militarism and absolutist officialdom. Under a harsh regime of compulsory education in which teachers were recruited from the ranks of former non-commissioned officers, the young were instilled with a typical Prussian obedience. The rigors of school life were succeeded by a prolonged period in barrack or on active military service. It was here that the German mind received its last coat of varnish. Anything that has not been done in schools was achieved in the army. In the minds of many contemporaries, the link between Prussianism and Nazism was obvious. The German emigre Edgar Stein Ruthbath described Hitler, notwithstanding the dictator's Austrian birth, as the arch-Prussian, and declared that the whole structure of his dreamed-of Reich was based on not only on material achievements of the Prussian state, but even more on the philosophical foundations of Prussianism, whatever that means. In the study of German industrial planning, published in 1943, Joseph Borotkin, an American official who later helped to prepare the case against the giant chemical combine IG Farben at Nuremberg, observed that the political evolution of the Germans had long been retarded by a ruling class of Prussian Junkers who had never been unsaddled by social change, and concluded that the Prussian Weltschauung, which basically means worldview, of political and economic world hegemony, is well sprung from which both Hohenzollern imperialism and National Socialism flow. Like many such accounts, this book drew on a tradition of German critical commentary on Prussian history and German political culture more generally. It would be difficult to overstate the hold of this scenario of power lust, civility, and political archaism over the imaginations of the policymakers most concerned with Germany's post-war fate. In a speech in December of 1939, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden observed that Hitler is not so unique as all that. He is merely the latest expression of the Prussian spirit of military domination. The Daily Telegraph published a discussion of the speech under the headline, Hitler's rule is in the tradition of Prussian tyranny, and there were positive comments throughout the tabloid press. On the day of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Winston Churchill spoke memorably of the hideous onslaught of the Nazi war machine with its clanking, heel-clicking, dandified Prussian officers, and the dull-drilled, docile, brutish mass of the Hun soldiers plodding on like a swarm of crawling locusts. Again, interesting continuity between a figure like Churchill, who was around for that entire time when we talk about the Boxer Rebellion. In an article for the Daily Herald in November of 1941, Ernest Bevin, Minister in Labour in Churchill's war cabinet, he would later be the Foreign Secretary, by the way, declared that German preparation for the current war had begun long before the advent of Hitler. Even if one got rid of Hitler, Goering and the others, Bevin warned, the German problem would remain unsolved. It was Prussian militarism with its terrible philosophy that had to be got rid of from Europe for all time. It followed that the defeat of the Nazi regime itself would not suffice to bring the war to a satisfactory close. In a paper presented to Cabinet in the summer of 1943, Labour leader Clement Attlee warned passionately against the notion that it might be possible in the aftermath of the regime's collapse to do business with some kind of German successor government drawn from the traditional elites of German society. The real aggressive element in German society, he argued, was the Prussian Junker class, and the chief danger lay in the possibility that this class, which had allied itself with the masters of heavy industry in Westphalia, might depose the Nazi leadership and present itself to the Allies as a successor government prepared to settle peace terms. The error of 1918 has been to allow these elements to remain as a bulwark against Bolshevism. This must not happen again. Only the liquidation of the Junkers as a class must, Attlee argued, eradicate Prussian virus. So, as you can tell, I mean, that's from Attlee, who later became Prime Minister in 1945 and was Prime Minister officiating over Law 46. Attlee's argument, of course, is fundamentally socialistic in the sense that he sees everything from the lens of class warfare. The Junkers are this representation, archaic representation of feudalism, and in order for democratic socialist Germany to be brought about, it must, again, result in the liquidation of class. But also think about this. he acknowledges, against all of the precursive arguments, he acknowledges that there is a distinction between Prussia and National Socialism. He acknowledges the German resistance is filled with Prussian Junkers, and yet he sees the deposition of Hitler based on a Prussian antipathy towards Hitler as unacceptable. He would fight total war to end the Prussian menace, irrespective of who was in charge of Germany, even if it led to peace in Europe. Such is the visceral hatred from, again, Western and in part democratic socialist leftist opinion in Germany, that even a opposition towards Hitler isn't enough. It requires an entire elimination of a way of life which is associated with this incredibly subjective and nebulous idea of Prussiandom, which, as we've been talking about, is theoretically consistent, but very much ahistorical if you look at the specifics. What do you think of that, Marcus?
You know, I can't disagree. Also, there's a sort of, you might call it like a pragmatism via deceit as well, in that the West, as in, you know, what would become, I suppose, the nexus of NATO and, you know, the so-called free democratic West against the, you know, USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries, needed a Germany, you know, in the post-war reality of what Europe would be from an economic standpoint and a military standpoint. I mean, in the end, we sort of, you know, come 1960, the Federal German Republic is a fundamental component of NATO strategy, and West Germany becomes a very fundamental part of the European Economic Community. The ECC is predecessor to the, you know, the EU, but obviously more of as an economic entity than a political one, strictly speaking. And so, I mean, none of us can put ourselves in the mind of these individuals, but was there a part of them that was sort of thinking from a standpoint of pure pragmatism, that how can we perhaps carve out the better part of the remains of a Germany that still has, you know, that is still identifiably German and still is a polity and a government and an administration that can, you know, tend to the needs of the German people and manage their affairs as a government ought to. But we cut out this sort of intolerable militaristic cancer that has been the thorn in the ribs of the liberal West for the better part of a century, and offering Prussia as the convenient scapegoat seems to be fitting.
I don't. What do you essentially mean by that?
Well,
just
because
quickly summarized.
no. Insofar that, you know, to have laid the blame entirely, you know, within the German identity would have made it a rather more difficult thing to sort of coalesce a post-war Germany. In this case, they're sort of creating a distinction between Prussia and Germany as sort of two separate things, and that by eviscerating and, like as the title of this video is, to mastermind the extinction of Prussia, its identity, its very land and its institutions, that they can carve that off, blame the course of the war and this sort of militaristic spirit that is within Germany on Prussia and the Prussian identity and Prussian history, and then reconstitute sort of a new Germany in the ashes of you know, post-war Europe. If you get,
Yes,
do you follow what I mean, or not really?
well, yes, that's the consistent argumentation made there. My point is more focused. I mean, obviously, but my point is more focused on the idea that I'm going to get into Woodrow Wilson's point here, but aptly would rather continue on in this war of annihilation against Germany, even if he were given a peace offer. You know, it's the whole idea that we must never repeat 1918. The entire German state must be extinguished. And again, I wonder about the effect of morale. You know, had, say, for example, the 20th of July plot succeeded, had, you know, a very generous peace offer, you know, been handed, which would basically have massively truncated Germany, resulted in the wholesale evacuation of territories, but left a government behind. How you could basically instill morale when the terms are basically allowed for that situation to happen. Again, it's the whole nature of unconditional surrender, that you will continue to fight on until basically you are able to impose your own conception of a new German identity through force of arms, even if it means prolonging the war unnecessarily.
Indeed, and leading to the deaths of thousands and thousands of your own men, as was true for the American British forces. I mean, you got to think, from the landing at Normandy up until the surrender of German forces in May 45. I mean, there were tens of thousands of men killed and hundreds of thousands of men injured, just for the sake of imposing an unconditional defeat upon Germany. The other point being is that sort of coalescing with the sentiments expressed by Attlee. I mean, this is why it actually, a German state didn't actually come into to fruition immediately after the war. What you had was the sectors of occupation, and what would become East Germany was obviously occupied by the Soviet Union and the USSR. But you sort of had the three occupation sectors in the West. You had the British in the North, centered around sort of Kiel and Hanover. And Bremen sort of up there, and then the Rhineland and sort of the central Western Germany was administered by France, and then the Americans were based in the south, in Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, essentially, deleting Germany from the map, at least for several months and a couple of years, and only in the aftermath of that was a new federal republic sort of established. But for a little while after the war, Attlee's wishes sort of were reality, if we really think about it.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. I'm simply just saying it's.
Oh no, I'm just making the point.
I'm just saying that this is, I mean, obviously, but what I'm saying is that it's again indicative of something just beyond realpolitik and beyond grand strategy to think that. Because, like I said, this is a culmination.
It borders on evil, really.
Well, this is like I said, this is a culmination. This was an idea that was espoused and was very in vogue among a certain section of American and British thinkers long before 1939. But the point I'm going to make now is that the resistance, the German resistance from 1938 onwards, led by Beck, made several entreaties, actually through the Vatican of all places, because of the Catholic connection and the Reichskordat, etc., to the West, including feeding information. And as you know, Canaris and the Abwehr were also part of the German resistance, feeding.
In Canaris's case, for almost the entire duration of the war, he was only executed like days before the war ended.
Yes,
as well.
Exactly. But the point I'm making is there was a whole sort of premise which the Allies could build around, which is effectively regime change in Germany, which was supported by a formidable faction which almost opposed Hitler on the 20th of July 1944. But they never, ever seriously considered that an option. And the opinion from Attlee, effectively, is that it cannot be considered to be an option because it is a virus that must be liquidated. That is the extent of the hatred which is borne out towards Germany, not towards National Socialism, but towards Germany itself. Even if it means we can find a solution to the war, we must fight a war which results in the annihilation of Prussia, the execution of a nation.
The animating spirit and identity has to be liquidated, has to be vaporized in the ashes of warfare, and that really sort of should bring to attention. I mean, never mind us and how shall I say, people who sort of share our perspective, but for those who are sort of a little bit more attached to, shall I say, popular narratives of this time period, should take that into account. Because I mean, in the end, it was in the Anglosphere where books with sort of titles "Germany Must Perish" were published, and it's those sort of sentiments that are, it's not fringe. You're talking about Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister who wins power in 1945, who more or less shares that view, maybe less from a strictly ethnic perspective, but certainly one from a cultural and a spiritual and an identitarian perspective, that these cancers that threaten our worldview and our entire belief systems have to be eviscerated, which is really sort of stronger terminology and stronger sentiment than anyone in Germany had towards Britain or America, for that matter, which is an interesting thought.
Well, it's interesting to consider that there is direct antipathy and friction between a conception of Prussia, which is essentially added to the loincloth of National Socialism via Goebbels, and then the actual friction between the military element, which directly opposes Hitler, and the Allies are more than content to lump these two opposing elements together and annihilate them both. But this is only compounded by the view of Roosevelt here. For President Roosevelt, too, the assumption that Prussia was a historical source of militarism and aggression played a central role in his conception of policy vis-a-vis Germany. And this is Roosevelt. This is one thing that I want to make perfectly clear, he would tell Congress on September the 17th, 1943. When Hitler and the Nazis go out, the Prussian military clique must go with them. The war-breeding gangs of militarists must be rooted out in Germany. If we are to have any real assurance of future peace, the memory of 1918, when Woodrow Wilson had refused to parley with the military masters and the monarchical autocrats of Germany, was still vivid. Yet the military system that had sustained the German war effort had survived the privations inflicted by the Peace of Versailles to mount a renewed campaign of conquest only 2 decades later. For Roosevelt, as with Attlee, it followed that the traditional Prussian military authorities were no less of a threat than the peace with the Nazis. There could be no negotiated armistice with the military command, even in the event that Hitler's regime were to be deposed from within or to collapse. In this way, the idea of Prussianism made an important contribution to the policy of unconditional surrender adopted by the Allies at the Casablanca Conference of January of 1943. And as someone else is making more important in the chat, the hatred towards all elements of Germany is compounded in the Morgenthau Plan, which would involve the deindustrialization of Germany, which of course would mean one element of Prussianism, which they associate with, which is IG Farben and the Krupp works and the whole heavy industries that are located in the Ruhr, which of course located in Prussia. These elements need to be need to be gotten rid of in the same sense that we need to get rid of the old East Elbe aristocracy.
Because in the end, like what drove the German war machine, it was Daimler, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, MAN, like all the companies that built the German equipment that they fought with, all had to be dismantled. And of course, the deindustrialization of Germany would have caused its eternal impoverishment. So make of that what you will.
Among the Allies, only the Soviets remained aware of the tension between the Prussian tradition and the National Socialist regime. While the July plot of 1944 evoked little positive comment among Western politicians, the Soviet official media found words of praise for the conspirators. Soviet propaganda, by contrast with that of the Western powers, consistently exploited Prussian themes. The National Committee for a Free Germany, established as a propaganda vehicle in 1943 and composed of captured German officers, appealed explicitly to the memory of the Prussian reformers, above all Gneisenau, Stein, and Clausewitz, all of whom had resigned their Prussian commissions during the French occupation and joined the army of the Tsar. York, the man who ignored the command of his king to walk across the ice to the Russians in 1812, the Taurogan Convention, naturally held pride of place. And of course, this is actually an explicit reference to Friedrich von Paulus. And the irony, of course, that Hitler made Paulus during the war, during the Battle of Stalingrad, a field marshal a day before he surrendered, on the basis that, for history, no Prussian field marshal had ever surrendered. He does surrender, and then the Soviets have a Prussian field marshal that can fit this role basically as an icebreaker against National Socialism. This was all eyewash, of course, yet it was also reflected as specifically Russian perspective on Prussia's history. The history of relations between the two states was no chronicle of unremitting mutual hatred. Stalin's hero, Peter the Great, was a warm admirer of Prussia, the Great Elector, whose administrative innovations served as a model for his own reforms. Russia and Prussia had cooperated closely in the partitioning of Poland, and the Russian alliance was crucial to Prussia's recovery after Napoleon in 1812. Relations remained warm after the Napoleonic Wars, when the diplomatic bond of the Holy Alliance was reinforced by the marriage of Frederick Wilhelm III's daughter Charlotte to Tsar Nicholas I. The Russians backed Austria in the duelist struggles of 48 to 50, but favored Prussia with a policy of benevolent neutrality in the War of 1866. This, in my opinion, by the way, is the reason why Bismarck was able to win the Wars of Unification. So that shouldn't be understated. The assistance rendered to the beleaguered Bolsheviks in 1718 and the close military collaboration between the Reichswehr and the Red Army during the Weimar years, and that allowed basically the German army to retain some form of militarization under stealth. Recent reminders of this long history of interaction and cooperation, yet none of this could preserve Prussia from disillusion at the hands of the victorious Allies. Now this is very interesting because I'm not sure if you remember, Marcus, but a very long time ago, we discussed the film Valkyrie, and an element of that was discussing the dynamics of the Kreisau Circle. And many
I do remember this, actually.
and many more perspicacious members of the German resistance believed that we shouldn't be making a peace offer with the West. We should instead be making entreaties towards the Soviet Union. And this opens up a whole discussion about how not only Soviets at the time dealt with the German resistance, but how the Soviets and the East German government dealt with the Prussian legacy. And I have here, just to compound this, a segment from TCW Blanning's The Death and Transfiguration of Prussia, which is focused on Marxist reading of Prussian history. Again, to be held in contrast to what I've just been reading out, which is very much a British American-led effort, which then permeates into the critical Frankfurt School of the 1960s. There was sufficient latitude in the Marxist oeuvre, that obviously being the compilation of Marxist historians' works, to allow the East Germans to change tact without attracting charges of apostasy. The change was abrupt. Of course, we're talking about the vilification to reconciliation. During the early years of the existence of the DDR, it had expressed hostility to the Prussian past in the direct, not to say crude manner of demolishing some of its more obtrusive memorials, the Royal Palace in Berlin and the tower of the Garrison Church at Potsdam, for example. Fortunately, this iconoclasm did not demand the total destruction of Christian Daniel Rauch's equestrian statue of Frederick the Great. It was removed from its site in the middle of the Unter den Linden and put into a store. There it languished until 1963, when it was allowed out for recreation in the Sanssouci Hippodrome at Potsdam. It was only very recently, in November of 1980, this was written a long time ago, that it was returned to its old position. So once again, der alte Fritz, the old Fritz, rides eastwards down the main boulevard of his old capital, allegedly to the annoyance of Polish tourists. By that time, the DDR was experiencing a Preußenwelle. By that, effectively, he means a Prussian wave, a new sort of historical sense of nostalgia pertaining to Prussian history. The DDR was experiencing a Preußenwelle all of its own. Not unreasonably, West German commentators have concluded that it was the decision to mount the 1981 exhibition taken in 1978, which spurred their Eastern counterparts into action. An early sign that not all Prussian history was regarded as lousy was a 5-part television series called Scharnhorst, although it has been said that the periods of Russo-Prussian cooperation, such as was exemplified by the career of Scharnhorst, were never been out of fashion. More arresting was the fact that Erich Honecker, General Secretary of the Socialist Uniparty, began to speak of Frederick the Great rather than Frederick II, something which many Western historians cannot bring themselves to do. Honecker also observed that a deep relationship with history strengthens the citizens' attachment to their socialist fatherland and increases their pride in the achievements of the socialist revolution. The message was soon heeded by the East German historical profession. Official publications began to talk of the two faces of Prussia, to call for a more active engagement with Prussian history and for a wider historical consciousness in the DDR. With an unusual but welcome candor, it was conceded that socialist historians' picture of Prussia had been distorted by the need of the revolutionary workers' movement of the 19th and 20th century to fight a battle with the Prussian state, and in fact Prussia had two sides to it. That reactionary militarism had been accompanied by an extraordinary dynamism and ability to adapt to a bourgeois world. Perhaps the clearest indication of a sea change in East German attitudes to their Prussian past was an article published by a triumvirate of leading historians, Horst Bartel, Ingrid Mittenzweig, and Walter Schmidt, in the summer of '79. They stressed the dual nature of Prussia. In Prussian history, too, there were reactionary and progressive elements. It was all the more necessary in their view for Marxist-Leninist historians to deal with Prussian history because the bourgeois historians of the West were hard at work on a campaign of distortion designed to hijack it for their own fell purposes. I've already mentioned the logic that we see with the quote-unquote progressive Prussian state as the bulwark of Weimar constitutionalism. So it's actually very easy when you're thinking about grafting a Marxist-Leninist perspective in terms of historical identity. And of course, it's interesting, isn't it, in the West, as we're seeing a demonization process, we're seeing a reorganization of Prussian distinctive identity in East Germany, which is advocating for the progressive, quote-unquote, elements, i.e. Hegelianism, the veneration of the state, the rise
The
of Prussian
redemptive qualities of
socialism,
it, you might say,
redemptive
from
qualities. And of course, from a political point of view, this is socialism. It's kind of like a new version of socialism in not one country, but shows socialism in part of a country. We can rally and cement the power of the Socialist Uniparty under Erich Honecker
Mm.
by appealing to a grounded past, not a deracinated cosmopolitan socialism. So it makes
Yes.
sense from the Russian, from the
It,
Soviet and the DDR point of view.
it makes me chuckle insofar that on one hand, there's a certain interpretation, probably one that I can't speak for yourself, obviously, but I think there's a few guys in our circle do adhere to, and that's the idea of that Stalin being something of a red czar, right? Meanwhile, after the dismembering of Germany post 45 and the reconstitution of an East Germany under the Warsaw Pact, what you kind of have is this sort of the gentle re-emergence of a red eagle of a Soviet Prussia in a sense. And it's kind of interesting too because if you look even from say a military standpoint, the even the uniforms that the DDR soldiers wear is actually more reminiscent of the uniforms of the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht vis-a-vis those in West Germany. Even like for instance, in terms of their Volkslieder and their march leader, the East German army actually they create a number of their own marches and songs and whatever, but a number of the older songs are actually maintained, even if the lyrics are changed, but they're actually maintained as a part of the East German identity, as is I think even their boots are more similar. Their marching style is more similar, although it's not a Gustav, but he's more similar. A lot of these elements and aspects of Prussian militarism are actually kept more alive in the DDR than in the GDR, and I think that's it's one interesting sort of conspicuous example of that you can see. But there's obviously more underlying bureaucratic and cultural elements that sort of bubble underneath, and ideological elements that bubble underneath that aren't so obvious, which you've just alluded to.
Just for reference, you mentioned Stalin. During the time of Stalin, of course, this would have been impossible due to the fact that East Germany, first of all, it wasn't recognized, but also it was basically just a hub to extract reparations and also for Russian soldiers to enact denazification. So
Yes.
it's only in the 1960s when you see the rise of the critical school that paradoxically you have Honecker basically imitating a form of Stalinism within East Germany itself. This, by the way, at a time you have the Brezhnevian reaction, but of course in the 1980s you have perestroika, and Honecker would basically be one of the final sort of redoubts against perestroika, and ultimately, he would fall when the Soviets sort of were no longer there to support him.
So the Russians were undoing Stalinism whilst Honecker was implementing Stalinism in East Germany.
Yes, exactly. He was reinforcing it.
Yeah.
By the autumn of 1945, there was a consensus among the various British organs involved in administration of occupied Germany that, in tellingly redundant formulation, this moribund corpse of Prussia must be finally killed. Moribund, as in the sense it was dying and finally killed. Its continued existence would constitute a dangerous anachronism. By the summer of 46, this was a matter of firm policy for the British administration in Germany. A memorandum of the 8th of August 1946 by the British member of the Allied Control Authority in Berlin put the case against Prussia succinctly. I need not point out that Prussia has been a menace to European security for 200 years, again, taking this subjective example and retroactively fitting it for all of Prussian history. The survival of the Prussian state, even if only in name, would provide a basis for irredentist claims, which the German people may later seek to put forward, would strengthen German militaristic ambitions and encourage the revival of an authoritarianism centralized Germany, which in the interest of all is vital to prevent. It's very interesting to consider that the Allies would actually indulge this irredentism once the honeymoon period between the Soviets and the West collapsed from about 1948, 1949 onwards, when West Germany was constituted under the CDU and Comrade Adenauer. They didn't renounce the claims on the East up until Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik. So it's interesting, isn't it, how
Which was in the early 70s, mid 70s, wasn't it? Willy Brandt?
Yes, early 70s.
Yeah,
So it's
that's
interesting, isn't it, that the Allies were so ideologically committed to anti-Prussianism that they're just doing
right.
Stalin's bidding, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, and of course they later realized their mistake when Truman gets in and things begin to stabilize somewhat. But the contrast to that view is this: the American and French delegations broadly supported this view. Only the Soviets dragged their feet, mainly because Stalin, still hoped to use Prussia as the hub of a unified Germany, over which the Soviet Union might eventually be able to secure control. By early February 1947, they too had fallen in step, and the way was open for the legal termination of the Prussian state. He doesn't really focus on this, which is a bit irritating, but what he means by that is this map on the left. This is a map of the modern Federal Republic of Germany, and superimposed are the Länder, the states. And as you can see, the dark green areas cover areas which were majority Prussia, which you can see if I can go back and find this map here, roughly analogous. And the idea essentially from Stalin is already it's been proven that Germany can be a progressive bulwark, that Prussia can be there to strengthen German unity. And so, as you can see, East Prussia has gone, yes, but Brandenburg and Westphalia and Hanover and all these territories can prevent the dissolution of Germany into West Prussia, into West Germany and East Germany. And that would mean that Stalin has his wish of ensuring a neutral Germany. So there is, again, it's not just the fact that we're talking about social German Prussian sort of socialism in one country under Erich Honecker, but there's a hard political calculus for Stalin to dispel with these, I would basically say hysterical and genocidal claims of the West to liquidate Prussianism in all its forms and say, well, if Prussia can survive, yes, we've gutted East Prussia, but that was the problematic element, the East Elbe element. We can hold on to this territory, which could be a progressive ally, and also ensure that the West won't partition Prussia. And it's fair to say that the West call out this gambit and they dissolve it. And I also believe that this understands the trajectory towards the breakdown relationships and the Berlin blockade in 1948, that Stalin, and indeed you can say even Beria later, believed that a united neutral Germany would be far more preferential than having a militaristic outpost in the form of East Germany. And that Prussia, as in 1918, 1919, Prussia would be the vehicle to ensure German unity. Of course, it worked in 1919, but in 1947 it fails to work and the Allies decide to dissolve it. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose that follows forward from the sentiments as expressed by, Attlee, Morgenthau, etc.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that we're talking about the Soviet Union having pragmatic views towards Prussia, isn't it? And the West are the ones that have the genocidal views.
Yes, no, I'm inclined to agree, and I think too this is what happens when we look at some of these perspectives regarding the USSR and the regime of Stalin from a slightly different lens. We sort of just tend to, for example, speaking for myself, having a less refined view of, say, the Soviet Union, and what a person is just kind of inclined to lump, Bukharin, Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin as sort of this primordial red soup, so to speak, but sort of understanding that there's actually nuances even within communism and Bolshevism, and that Stalin himself represents, say, quite a variance in this degree, even though, like, yes, he's still a communist, and yes, the USSR is still a leftist communist regime, but there are differences in how he interprets and implements that ideology vis-a-vis others that are mentioned and others that I have not mentioned, and how in some ways too there's this sort of, almost from a cultural standpoint, the Russians do have this tendency to have a pragmatic streak about them, and even though the USSR bore the brunt of the German military effort throughout the Second World War, they were still sort of sensible enough to actually consider the utility of Prussia and keeping it existent as an entity, or at least on paper, as an option for a potential reunification of Germany under, USSR, Warsaw Pact, Bolshevik auspices. Whereas in some ways, the liberal democratic West was arguably more idealistic about the idea of having to dismantle Prussia because of this eternal sort of reactionary militaristic thorn that Germany had been in the West's ribcage for the last 150 years.
But it's interesting again that this is a thematic through line where we're talking about the Kreisau Circle, the German resistance, Stalin's view towards the continuation of Prussia, and then Honecker later on. It should be noted, however, when I talk about the elimination of Prussia, of course, Stalin, he spent most of the responsibility for the map I have on the right. But like I said, it wasn't out of some sort of visceral desire to annihilate Prussia, but more, like I said, to effect the compensation of territories, which allowed the Soviet Union to gain the amalgamated territories in the East. It was again motivated by pure sort of Machiavellian power politics rather than the ideological lens that the West seemed to have in
Indeed.
excess, it seemed. In the meanwhile, the extirpation of Prussia as a social milieu was already well advanced. The Central Committee of the General Communist Party in the Soviet zone of occupation announced in August of 1945 that the federal estate owners and the Junker class had always been the bearers of militarism and chauvinism, and by this, effectively, they're espousing a view, the traditional Soviet view since collectivization, the liquidation of the kulaks. But it's interesting, isn't it, that there's such synergy between the Western view and the Eastern view in this regard, isn't it, when it talks about the
Yes, indeed.
implementation of classical Marxism, Leninism. The removal of their socioeconomic power was thus the first and fundamental precondition for the extirpation of Prussian militarism. There followed a wave of expropriations. No account was taken of political orientation of the owners or of their role in resistance activity. Like I said, this classical case of lumping everyone together and demonizing Prussiandom in the same way as the demonization of Nazism. Among those whose estates were confiscated was Ulrich Wilhelm Count Schwerin von Schwartenfeld, who had been executed on the 21st of October 1945 for his role in the July conspiracy. These transformations took place against the background of great wave of migrations in German history. During the last months of the war, millions of Prussians fled westwards from the eastern provinces to escape the advancing Red Army. Of those who remained, some committed suicide, others were killed or died of starvation, cold, or illness. Germans were expelled from East Prussia, West Prussia, Eastern Pomerania, and Silesia, and hundreds of thousands perished in the process. The emigrations and resettlements continued into the 50s and 60s. The looting or burning of the great East Elbian houses signaled not only an end of the socio-economic elite, but also of a distinctive culture and way of life. Finkenstein, with its Napoleonic memorabilia, Bornhund, with its collection of antiques, Walburg, with its Rococo library, Blumberg and Gross von Storff, with their memories of the liberal ministers von Schorn and von Schoeter, were among the many country seats to be plundered and gutted by an enemy bent on erasing every last trace of German settlement. So it was that the Prussians, or at least their mid-20th century descendants, came to pay a heavy price for the war of extermination that Hitler's Germany unleashed on Eastern Europe. The scouring of Prussia from the collective awareness of the German population began before the end of the war with a massive aerial attack on the city of Potsdam. And here I have images from the destruction of Potsdam. One is a general view of the city. One is an image of Potsdam Railway. And that is actually the ruin of the garrison church. But like I said, acted petty vindictiveness to destroy the garrison church as well. As a heritage site with little strategic or industrial significance, Potsdam was very low on the list of Allied targets and had been spared significant bombing until late in the war. During the evening of Saturday, the 14th April 1905, 491 planes of British Bomber Command dropped their payloads over the city, transforming it into a sea of fire. By the way, this is only 2 weeks before the end of the war, or Hitler's suicide at least. Almost half of the historical buildings of the old centre were obliterated in a bombing that lasted for only half an hour. When the fires had been extinguished and the smoke had cleared, the scorched 57-metre tower of the garrison church stood as the dominant landmark in a cityscape of ruins. Of the fabled carillon, famous for its automated renditions of the Leuten chorale, there remained only a lump of metal. The scouring continued after 45, and entire districts of the old city were cleared to make way for socialist reconstruction. Imperatives of post-war city planning were reinforced by anti-Prussian iconoclasm of the communist authorities. No Dresden pics. This is a Prussia stream, not a Saxony stream. Nowhere was the rupture with the past more comprehensive than in East Prussia. This is the thumbnail for the stream, by the way, which is the burning of Königsberg Castle. The northern east part of the province, including Königsberg, fell to the Soviet Russia as war booty. On the 4th of July 1946, the city was renamed Kaliningrad after one of Stalin's most faithful henchmen. He was technically actually the president of the Soviet Union. And the Sovietized district around it became...
Mikhail Kalinin, right?
Mikhail Kalinin, yes,
Yeah.
became the Kaliningradskaya Oblast. The city had been bitterly fought over during the last months of the war, and during the early post-war years, it remained a lunar landscape of ruins. What a city, one Soviet-Russian visitor declared in 1951. The tram leads us through the humped, narrow streets of erstwhile Königsberg, erstwhile because Königsberg truly is an erstwhile city. It doesn't exist. For kilometers in every direction, an unforgettable landscape of ruins. The old Königsberg is a dead city. Most of the historical buildings in the old centre were stripped and torn in an attempt to erase memories of its history. In some streets, only the Latin letters inscribed on the steel manholes covers of the city's late 19th century sewage system survived to remind passerby of an older history. Around the devastation of new Soviet city took shape, monotonous and provincial, cut off from the world by a military exclusion zone. In the western zones of occupation, too, the work of erasure proceeded apace. French policymakers and commenters spoke in the early post-war years of a need for wholesale de-Prussification. The bronze relief panels on the base of the Victory Column in 1871 in celebration of the triumphs of Prussian arms over the Danes and the Austrians in the French wars of German unification were removed by the French occupation authorities and shipped to Paris. They were handed back to Berlin only on the occasion of the city's 750th anniversary celebrations. Again, it's interesting, isn't it, that the French are definitely one to bear grudges, as in the same way that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, where the German proclamation of the Empire was, that all of the treasures, which were quote unquote again memorabilia or indicative of the original victory in that war, again, should be dismantled as part of this program of de-Prussification, because France, more than any of these countries, owed, you can say, the loss of its original great power status and primus inter pares of the nations in Europe, thanks to the adroit sort of politicking and military effectiveness of the Prussians under Bismarck.
You got to think in many cases it was a hammer blow in 1871. They had their blushes saved in 1914 as a result of the BEF, and then it took the Wehrmacht 6 weeks to, basically undo France as a military power in World War II. So for the French, it was very much a case of taking it personally and not letting go of a grudge.
Indeed. An even more emblematic fate awaited the colossal figures representing the historical rulers from the House of Hohenzollern that had once lined the Siegeshalle. These objects, bombastic masses of carved white stone, were transferred by the Nazi authorities to the Grosse Steinhalle, one of the axes of the future Reich capital planned by Albert Speer, Hitler's chief inspector of buildings. Here they spent the war draped in camouflage netting. In 1947, this was Germania. You can look at the building miniatures online if you have a chance. In 1947, they were torn down on the orders of the Allied Control Council in Berlin. In 1954, they were secretly buried in the sandy soil of Brandenburg, almost as if they were necessary to prevent the Germans from regrouping for battle around their ancestral Prussian totems. These impulses were carried over into the sphere of Allied re-education policies in the occupation zones. Here, the objective was to eliminate Prussia as a mental construct, to de-Prussianize the German imagination. What exactly this would mean in practice was never agreed among the Allies or concretely defined by any of the zonal administrations, the zones of occupation, the French, the American, the British, and the Russian zones, Soviet zones. But the idea was influential nonetheless. Prussia was de-emphasized in the teaching of German history. In the French zone in particular, traditional textbooks charting the teleological nationalist narrative culminating in the formation of the Bismarckian Empire of 1871 made way for narratives focused on Germany's pre-national history and the manifold ties with the rest of Europe, especially France. It's interesting, in my Bavaria stream about Ludwig II, I cited a book on German cultural history by Cavaliero, and his earnest hope in his preface was for a softer Germany, effectively. He was doing this basically in sight of his program, effectively, be to understand all of the smaller German states. And there's another consistent feature of doing history of 18th century German in particular, focusing on the smaller German states. And what do you think that is, Marcus? For the point of view of French policymakers.
I'm not too sure where you're going with that.
They were all under the cultural thrall of France to some extent.
Oh, true. Because even like in Bavaria, von Wittelsbach, I mean, he was quite enamored with French influence as well, if I'm not
Well,
mistaken.
I mean, if we're going to the Wittelsbach presence, we can go to the Nymphenburg Palace. We can go to
Precisely. Yeah.
the Emperor Charles VII, of course, was a French ally. You can
Yes.
say that much of the de-Prussianized history of Germany can basically be a history of French cultural hegemony over Germany, which is really, you can say, the case until
France over the Rhine, so to speak. You know.
Yes, then this is really the case until the mid-19th century, it should be mentioned, which is why figures like Wagner feature so prominently in terms of the German imagination. So that is another interesting offshoot when talking about the de-emphasis on Prussia when it comes to French histories taught in Germany. The focus on the smaller states is also talking about the dominance of French culture and French language within the courts of all of these German states. So, for example, take George I of England. One of the tirades against him is that he couldn't speak English. Well, of course, the language of the Hanoverian court wasn't German, it was French. And then French simply became the court culture of the court in England as well. So again, it's that all-pervasiveness of French culture.
And was also true for Savoy Piedmont as well.
Yes, well, you can say, like, and of course, Frederick the Great, it should be mentioned. I mean, Sanssouci is basically the Potsdam equivalent of a Petit Trianon or something like that in terms of a little retreat from the excesses of Versailles, which in the case of Prussia would be closer to something like a Charlottenburg. Where references to Prussia were unavoidable, they were given a markedly negative spin. In the new textbooks of the French zone, Prussia figured as a voracious reactionary power that had thwarted the beneficent effects of the French Revolution, again, the irony when we talk about Hardenberg, and destroyed the roots of the Enlightenment and democracy in Germany, again, the idea of democracy in Germany being a complete and utter nonsense in that period, and the idea of Frederick II being not only an exemplar of the Enlightenment, but the darling of Voltaire of all people, who, of course, is basically deified by the cause of the French Revolution. Bismarck, in particular, emerged from this process of reorientation with a reputation in ruins, and of course you can understand that. Frederick the Great, too, retreated from his privileged position in public memory, despite the best efforts of conservative historian Gerhard Ritter to rehabilitate him as an enlightened ruler. Allied policies were successful precisely because they harmonized with homegrown German, especially Catholic Rhenish and Southern German traditions, to the antipathy of Prussia. I want to come back to that point right at the end of the stream, but just to note it, every nation seems to have their own antipathy. America and Britain seem to, again, do it from an almost sort of ideologically, sort of sociologically driven view that the mission, basically, of the Allies is some form of great sort of socio-political form of revenge, which is to lump Prussia and the legacy of Nazism together, which, like I said, had really sort of come to the fore as early as 1900. For the French, it manifested in the form of the reassertion of French dominance over Europe and now German disunity, effectively, which, of course, had been to the major benefit of France, which allows France to emerge as the first power in Europe again during the time of de Gaulle. And, of course, for the Soviets, it's very effective in terms of allowing them to expropriate all of the wealth of the Prussian Junkers and to basically allow for their accelerated process of reparations and dekolonization in the East. So yes, every particular occupying power has their own incentive in executing Prussia as a nation.
Yes, and in their own way as well, offer the, like you say, for their own purposes and reasons, and have their own motivations for it. Like, you know, for instance, the French and the Soviets have, I suppose, they meet at the same point. They just do it through different ways and have different motivations for doing so.
So we go from that, and now we're talking about historiography from the period to justify that campaign. But now I want to focus on Prussia's execution in the eyes of the historian in particular. And this is going back to just segments from Blanning, but I'm also taking segments elsewhere. The notion that the historian is first and foremost a public educator, guiding public opinion along the right lines and checking any heterodox tendency to veer off to anachronistic branch lines, was not just a reaction to the Preußen Welle, like I said, the Prussian wave. For a generation of historians, Hans-Ulrich Wehler had been calling for a kind of history. He was an incredibly prominent historian, along with Jürgen Habermas in the Frankfurt Critical School, in calling for a living, political, critical, social science, responding to changing conditions and helping to change those conditions with a purpose that is fundamentally emancipatory. More specifically, the key task for the German historian is the destruction of the dangerous illusion that the Prussia Germany of 1871 should be a model for the present-day Federal Republic. By the way, Wehler died relatively recently in 2014, just in terms of a time frame. Anticipating that this didactic concept of the role of the historian might not command the universal support of his colleagues, Wehler launched a preemptive strike by suggesting that this was a mission which would be criticized only by historians ossified in antiquarian esoteric self-satisfaction, who considered the ivory tower of an alleged unpolemical, objective branch of the arts to be the most habitable of all buildings, which is a rather incredible way of attacking the whole notion that history is objective and deliberately inserting moralizing tendencies, lack of historicist tendencies, and politicizing notions. So rejecting the notion that historical scholarship can be value-free, emphasis on value-free, I'm sure you can understand I'm alluding to someone in particular there. Wehler and his ever-growing army of supporters have paraded candidly, not to say proudly, their conviction that social democracy represents the only way forward, and that historians have a vital function to perform in its construction. As their primary function is educative, it is not just permissible but essential that their history should be written from a political viewpoint. This was expressed well by Dirk Blasius, and the editor of one of the sociologist categories. Sorry, one second. Indeed, a belief, in German misdevelopment, which in German means Fehlentwicklung, and in complementary aberrant character of German history, Sonderweg, so both of those elements have been discussed at length during the stream, has become a kind of test of ideological respectability that was made explicit at a conference on Sonderweg by one of the concept's most vigorous defenders, one Kurt Sontheimer. The thesis of German historical elaboration, Sonderweg, even if it is not always called that, is essentially a component part of a new political consciousness, which must be directed towards the readmission of Germany into the circle of civilized, liberal, and peace-loving nations. As Thomas Nippedy, he's a sort of very renowned historian of Germany and Prussia, observed, in the court of the critical school, the historian is judge, prosecuting counsel, and even lawgiver. Prussia's fate has been decided long before it even stepped into the dock, and there can be no surprise when the black cap is donned, even if sentence is pronounced with disingenuous hesitancy. Now, have you heard of the Historikerstreit? Marcus?
Sorry?
Have you heard of the... Sorry, have I hope I haven't bored everyone to tears with it.
No, sorry, go on.
Have you heard of the Historikerstreit?
No, I have not.
The Historikerstreit was it's the historian's dispute, translated. It was basically a series of arguments in the 1990s after reunification, spurred on by a historian called Nolte, who was arguing that, in particular, the German view of the Holocaust should be contextualized as not being exceptional within the grand scheme of genocide throughout human history. And a series of historians, including Richard Evans, came back and said, and even one of my my personal sort of historical heroes, Reinhard Koselleck, came back and basically said, no, Germany has particular responsibility when it comes to making the Holocaust exceptional within the grand scheme of writing of history. And that whole notion of the Historikerstreit is consistent with this notion, effectively, of looking at arguments like the Sonderweg, misdevelopment, the anachronism, all of these things that have popped up in terms of the demonizing discourse of the desire to eliminate Prussia, to abolish Prussia. And it's linked with the Frankfurt School, the critical school, and their desire effectively to use history as a vehicle for political formation. It's important that in terms of being able to manifest our desired political aims, that being essentially of a form of socialism without the messianic utopian undertones, classical sort of Marxism, Leninism. One needs to do away with all of these anachronistic elements and double down basically on this presentist view of history. And the funny thing is, to some extent, I agree. I agree in the sense that I don't believe history can be value free, but it is this unashamed lambasting of the pursuit of objectivity in history as esoteric self-satisfaction, and unpolemical. This whole notion that history can be objective is simply laughed, and we must use history as a vehicle for political formation, and again, to act basically as moral rectors in the formation basically of a political consciousness. This is all rather remarkable because it's so unabashed, it's so brazen. I will come out and say that my view is fundamentally historicist. I have a somewhat relativistic view when dealing with historical subjects. I try and understand it from their point of view, which means that some people come away from some of my streams in particular thinking, oh, when I was doing Gorbachev, I must be a Bolshevik, because it seems that I'm taking a sympathetic view. Even that's what historians are supposed to achieve.
We've had the red Tsar, the red eagle. Now you have the red AM. So buckle up, guys.
Yes, I'm a Bolshevik, everyone. But the point is, objectivity. I understand objectivity is impossible in history, but objectivity is always an aim. It is the pursuit of objectivity less rather than the self-satisfaction that what we say is objective. In the writing of history, one understands that the worst thing that can happen is that everything you can say will be superseded by future evidence, and the worst thing that can happen to a historian is that they are ignored or relegated to a fad basically of historiographical sort of novelty, so to speak, in the same way that many historians from the 19th century simply aren't read anymore, and presentism infects so much of the sort of the writing of history. But nevertheless, this is taking it much further, because an important element to understand about the writing of history is that it is a creative enterprise. You can say, even going back to Schiller and Carlyle, there is an element of poetry as well. But the historian is creative, the historian has freedom, but the historian doesn't have license. In other words, like we saw with Soviet historiography, one shouldn't be willy-nilly reconstituting the history in order to serve explicitly political goals, whether it be East Germany in an attempt to basically create a Soviet amended version of Prussian history, or in the case of the critical school, to execute the notion of Prussian history in order to present a post-Prussian German political construct. All of these things they're relevant today, and I think you need to sort of understand this and understand why Prussia hasn't been rehabilitated. So, for example, we're talking about the Preußen Wehler, and you mentioned Christopher Clark. Christopher Clark represents a small element of that Preußen Wehler, effectively, especially in the English language. However, again, he has to deal with the legacy of the Historicus right. So about 10 years ago, there was finally the argument about whether the Hohenzollern properties in Prussia should be reconstituted, those palaces in Potsdam, because basically the palaces of the Hohenzollern family were basically confiscated by the state, both by effectively conclusively when it comes to East Germany. And so what Christopher Clark was doing was going out to Germany and saying, okay, well, we need to basically recognize that the Soviets didn't have the right to expropriate all their property. And then you have people like Richard Evans coming out and saying, no, due to the fact that some of the Hohenzollern supported Nazism, the expropriation of their property was justified. So this continues to this day. And again, I remember an article that I'll never forget by Richard Evans in the New Statesman 4 years ago, which was basically saying that do you remember the BLM riots and the destruction of statues? Well, he was basically writing that in terms of looking at the validity and the historical context for these sort of figures, the writing of history is basically, I agree, we agree with him to some extent. The history of writing is fundamentally elite. But where I disagree with him in terms of him thinking of it as a closed consensus, in the same way that we go back to the critical school and say that the historian must conform with our view, that the consensus basically is in many ways a process of political formation, not simply of knowledge formation in terms of the pursuit of truth. And in that sense, the sacralized, professionalized consensus-based history is not applicable to national memory. And so the destruction of statues and historical memorabilia is essentially these people who cry about the loss of history have no right to it because they're not represented by this elite. So that is probably the purest Wehlerian expression of this sort of view of the historian as of the Frankfurt and the critical school as being moral rector. Would you say that's the case, Marcus?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, the thing is, the subject is obviously a tad touchy, and our friends in the chat have alluded to it as much. But I think it's the unique quandary of dealing with 20th century German history is that I think for people to be able to make hay of it as academically and commercially, they obviously have to see Germany itself and see the activity of the German people and the German government, especially so within a certain time frame, through a certain lens without any kind of divergence. And I think you even get someone as adept and as nice to read as Christopher Clark is, and clearly knowledgeable on the subject of Germany. The Iron Kingdom is probably one of the best books on this that you can read. But of course, getting to the 20th century, just the whole notion of being either bias free or value free just goes out the water. And it's obviously to adhere to this principle as post 1945. There has to be a prism through which German history is seen.
Well, no. The problem is, I agree. I agree to some extent that all value-free history is, to some extent, a nonsense. And like I said, history is not objective. History is in the pursuit of the objective. The differences here is the brazen information that the historian is the moral rector, effectively. My point of view.
But that's the point I'm about about it being very specific to this era and to this country in this way.
No, I agree. But what I'm saying is, even within the context of German historiography, that view is incredibly contentious. It is not sacrosanct. German historiography, and like I said, the whole sort of elite structure means that you can have a historikerstreit, you can have the diffusions within understanding and nuances of historiography. But like I said, it's the explicit will of the historian to be involved in the act of moralizing and policy formation, basically. There is an extent to which there is an extent to which all history is that, implicitly or explicitly. But in the case of someone like Wehler, Habermas isn't nearly as bad. It becomes explicit policy. And why I'm bringing all this up explicitly is to say that the execution of Prussia is not just a physical fact in terms of the dismemberment of territory and the cleansing of the population. It's not just a fact in terms of the dismantling of the institutions. It's not simply a fact in terms of the liquidation and expropriation of the wealth and personages of the Junkers. It's not just a fact in terms of some sort of messianic cause built into the doctrine of unconditional surrender by the Allies. It's also a historical prerogative by some historians, a historical what's the word I'm looking for? Yes, it is. It's a historical prerogative of these historians to even today.
A necessity almost, yeah.
Yes, a necessity to demonize, even say, for example, wholesale the Hohenzollern family, because members of the Prussian aristocracy and members of the Prussian royal family were involved in Nazism. Ergo, the whole thing is tainted and should be vilified forever. It's it's very interesting. But the final point I want to make for this stream is to follow in the spirit of the critical school, which is to bring up a segment by Hans-Jürgen Puhle, who wrote the following. There was no Prussian cultural nation. For Prussia was part of the German nation, and there was scarcely anything amounting to a Prussian culture or a Prussian art, except at most perhaps in certain peculiarities the building of style of Schüler, Eosander, Nobelsdorf, Schinkel, Langhans, and in the sculptures and shadow of Rauch. This is no accident, for as a rule it was a state which gave commissions to architects, but already in painting there are problems. The artist Menzel was just inspired by Prussian history. Liebermann or Ziller were Berliners in the same way that Others were Rhinelanders or Silesians. They were not Prussian painters because there was no Prussian style. Prussia's official philosophy, Hegel, and Prussia's favorite writer of the early 19th century, Schiller, were Swabians. Like the Hohenzollerns, Leibniz, Moses, Mendelssohn, and Kant were universal, as were Marx, Engels, Heine, or Max Weber. Anyone familiar with German history should understand, be familiar with those names. Although Prussian reality gave them much to think about, even the Prussian writers, Kleist and Fontaine, suffered more from Prussia and criticized her more than they wrote specifically in a Prussian style. I started this episode by talking about the execution of a nation. We talk about a militant tendency, and why I believe that Puhle is going out of his way to decimate the idea of a Prussian cultural nation by simply saying that these are all Germans who just so happen to find themselves in the reality of Prussian statehood, is basically to say that if you can dismantle, Marcus, the notion of a Prussian cultural nation, then you are simply left with the militaristic reactionary cliche, aren't you, Marcus?
There's no soul, only the vessel, the carcass left behind, and that's easy to dispose of, right?
Yes, it is. And the interesting thing is, I mean, like I said, to some extent, that is correct, because part of the issue with with Prussia expanding into Germany, rather than, as I showed before, Prussia retaining its eastern territory here, is that Prussia, again, was a nation, but not in the sense that it was a distinct civilization, distinct from the rest of Germany. Like I said, during the 18th century, Germany was under the thrall of the French. When we talk about the creation of a German culture as a hegemonic culture within Germany itself during the 19th century, again, it is very much a action in which all Germans participate. I mean, we talk about like the Bayreuth Festival to be one sort of supreme example. But nevertheless, I look to say, for example, someone as Ludwig II, as I covered recently, and say there is a very much a Bavarian particularism which informs so much of the musical and artistic and architectural formation within Bavaria itself, in the same way that within Austria, one can look to the later Franz Josephian period and say that there is a very much a distinctive musical style in the form of the Second Viennese School, in the form of the Secession, in the form of Klimt, in the form of the music of Strauss, in the form of the music of Mahler, and also in the forms of the architecture, the creation of the Ringstrasse, etc., all of which is quintessentially Austrian. Puhle is basically denying Prussia that same artistic agency in that sense, even though Berlin became one of the greatest cultural centers of Europe, for better or worse, when it comes to the transition of the Weimar Republic. When you go to Potsdam, it is very much obviously influenced by the French model, but it is a form of Rococo and Baroque architecture, which is very much infused in a specific militaristic style, even taking, say, for example, the Garrison Church or the State Palace, or even the Berlin Cathedral. All of these particular elements, I would say, are sort of uniquely Prussian in terms of the zeitgeist that they represent. Indeed, you can look at this and say, well, in terms of an architectural legacy, you had an architectural legacy. You had an architectural legacy in the sense of all of these grand Prussian manorial estates. It just so happens that all of them have been decimated and ransacked.
Yeah.
You can look at the city of Königsberg and say, this is the great city of the seven bridges. This is the home of Kant. And yet Kant has been made a universalized figure because he is an exponent of the Enlightenment. He is now no longer Prussian, because to be Enlightenment is to be anti-Prussian, even though we talk about enlightened absolutism as originating from Prussia. Like I said, the feeling of the desire to eliminate Prussiandom means that one has to take all of these elements and subvert them in a certain way for the, as someone's mentioning in the chat, the moral imperative.
And just because I did come across this in Iron Kingdom, and I have Clark to thank for this, is that one of the great engine rooms of sort of Enlightenment thinking was that. So I apologize if I mispronounce this, but the Piast or the Piast movement, which originally did come from the Netherlands via the Dutch, but it absolutely achieved prominence in the former Holy Roman Empire within the German lands as a result of its embracing by Prussia, and sort of that's overlooked as well. And like you say, it's sort of considered that to be Prussian is to be sort of anti-Enlightenment, but via Prussian institutions and the Prussian intelligentsia, what we actually see is very much the nexus, the sort of the embryonic beginnings of Enlightenment thought in northern Germany, via Prussia and via the adoption of this movement, and later the wholehearted embracing of Protestantism by the Hohenzollerns as well.
So the final thing we need to consider is, obviously, we talked about the historical legacy and we talked about the arguments pertaining to 1947, but now we have to come to post-Prussia, the post-Prussian reality that we see in Germany today. And Clark, in many ways, actually chimes not with the idea of Prussia basically being culturally barren, which would reinforce this critical school idea that Prussia has basically not survived the verdict of the historian's craft. But in this sense, we're talking about the particularism of the territories within Prussia. I've been at pains to say again that part of the problem with Prussian identity was the expanding into Germany. And what effectively emerges as a result of Bismarckian conquests, including Hanover, is a growth of German particularism within the regions. Because Brandenburg, say, for example, has been subsumed into Prussia as basically encompassing nearly half of Germany, Brandenburger identity needs to be reasserted. As Bismarck is pursuing the Kulturkampf, Rhinelander identity needs to be pursued. And again, it's impossible to consider maybe the whole notion of Rhineland sentiments and secessionism in 1918 had it not been for the Kulturkampf and for Bismarck basically othering the Catholic populations and making them Prussian and yet anti-Prussian in a sense. In the same way that Hanover very much vilified the whole process that they were annexed by the Prussians during the War of 1866. And the irony, of course, Marcus, is that when we arrive at 1947, 1948, is that the same man who was basically who was a Prussian civil servant in the classical sense through and through, a mayor of Cologne, and also a sponsor of Rhenish separatism against Prussia. Like I said, Prussia being instrumental in holding the Weimar Republic, the Weimar Germany together. He is now the one who is primarily sort of there in terms of the formation of a new West German identity. And I find it fascinating that, again, the Catholic CDU in the ascendancy for the first 20 years of the Federal Republic of Germany's existence in the West, that he chooses Bonn to be the capital of West Germany. And the reason being that obviously Bonn is close to his own power center of Cologne. And yet Bonn was also the capital of the electorate of Cologne. So when you're conceiving of a new identity for Rhineland-Westphalia as distinctively anti-Prussian, there seems to be a conscious element which is instead associating itself with the Catholic electorate. Effectively, you can say it is Colonna identity colonizing what is left of Prussia, in the same sense that you see all these federal districts which are being divided, and we also see the restoration of Hanover, we see the restoration of Hesse, and as you can see in this map here, these areas were decimated as a result of the Bismarckian annexations in 1866. So all of these old regions are reasserting themselves. The exceptions, of course, to this are Bavaria, Württemberg-Baden, and indeed Saxony, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, it is that reassertion that the Kulturkampf was an attempt by Bismarck to assimilate the Catholics into a standardized Prussian culture as a result of religious discrimination. And in the end, the legacy of the Kulturkampf created or helped create, in the form of the Free State of Prussia, a democratic bastion for the Weimar Republic. And then you can say a basis for the first 20 years of the West Germany's existence in the form of the state originating around Bonn. But it goes further than that. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that after 10 million Germans fled and were reconstituted, repatriated into West Germany, that it could have perhaps led to a Prussian culture or sort of identification. You can say the rest of Germany could have been Prussified to some extent. We've already talked, however, about the attempts of the Allies and their formal de-Prussification campaigns. However, there is also an element that when the Prussians from the east came back to the west, they were instead thinking of themselves not as Prussians, but as Pomeranians, as Silesians, There was even a segment in
Regionalists.
regionalists, effectively, even the segment when it comes to Memel, and say, actually, no, we're not Prussians, we were Salzburgers, as a result of one particular group of Salzburgian, of course, part of Austria, colonists to that region. So they come back and they have eschewed their Prussian identity. But like I said, it's not fair to say that this is extinguished, even though there's been such a mass cultural campaign, an education campaign, a political campaign to de-Prussify the German nation, because those aspirations for territorial reconquest and not recognizing East Germany were still apparent all the way up until 1970. But nevertheless, I think it's important to consider that fact as to why Prussia as a nation has sort of very little in terms of cultural purchase today, in terms of politics. It is very much seen as a point of nostalgia. But the historian's point of view, it is an integral element in terms of understanding the unification of Germany. For me, it is important to understand the trajectory of the Weimar Republic. And it's also important to understand the whole historiographical conception of Germany and this desire basically to eliminate the anachronism of Prussia vis-a-vis modernization. But that, in a sense, again, is all part of the meta. In terms of the practical existence of modern day Germany, as you can see, there's very little of a Prussian element that still exists. Hence why I go back to the original title, that it wasn't enough simply for Prussia to lose, for Prussia to be abolished, but Prussia needed to be executed. It needed to be vilified. The institutions needed to be abolished. The territory needed to be dismembered. And of course, if you go to Poland nowadays, these territories are almost entirely Polonized. There's very little in the way of a German population, even though ironically, being part of the European Union, you could have thought, couldn't you, that there could have been a de facto colonization of the territories through stealth, thanks to freedom of movement. Alas, that hasn't happened. But anyway, that's the end of my rant.
Yeah, I was going to say, because actually I just saw your mouse cursor was just in Silesia. Funnily enough, there is something of a tiny German minority left, and that minority does actually exist in Silesia. There's a sort of a cluster of Germans around Breslau and Uppel that remained, although they're still like not a particularly large minority. But that is about those places there. That part of Silesia is about the only remnant, the ethnic remnant of what was once a thriving sort of German province and German community. The rest of it is more or less gone now.
So I think in terms of my discussion, that's really all I have to say. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion?
The only thing I will mention is I did make a bit of a flub before. I mentioned Reichsführer, because obviously that's the title that was given to Himmler. I don't know. I was thinking of the Führerprinzip, the idea of like the leader principle, and sort of like the combining of the chancellorship and like Reichspresident into a single role, and that was sort of embodied by Hitler and the title of Führer. And the collective nature of those powers put together, and then obviously in the post-enabling act sort of time period, he was then granted executive powers that were never relinquished, and he only sort of accrued more power and sort of essentially became like the leader, person of Germany. I just got my terms mixed up. I meant to say Führerprinzip, not Reichsführer.
No, that's fine. So I'll just go over a couple of super chats and then we can get out of here. Just give me a second. There's actually only one.
Just while you pull it up, I will make mention that I do recommend that even like just perusing the Wikipedia article is worth it, but it is definitely worth reading more sort of detailed, sources and detailed descriptions of events. But the expulsion of the Ostdeutsch and the Volksdeutsche from the east, and not just the expulsion, the murder of millions of them, and thousands and thousands, countless thousands of German girls and women were raped by the Red Army, and particularly by the ideological units of the Red Army, the NKVD, etc., and a lot of their sort of re-echelon auxiliary troops. It is probably a demographic and ethnic disaster comparable to, say, the Anatolian genocides against the Greeks and the Armenians by the Turkish, initially by the Ottomans, but then by the Young Turks, sort of through that period of 1915 to sort of the early 1920s, and a lot of people, I mean, not people in our sphere necessarily, but a lot of people do not appreciate that this disaster actually befell, common people in Eastern Europe, and it's definitely something that deserves to be mentioned, because alongside the you said it wasn't enough to just dismantle Prussia; it had to be sort of executed, and you could say it was like cleaved apart and acid dipped and vaporized into the ether. And a part of that was the displanting of those people from places where they had lived for generations, and the liquidation of whole populations of people. And then the survivors were sort of huddled together in this sort of truncated remnant of Germany. It is a human catastrophe that is not nearly given the attention it deserves.
I just want to point out for people listening that that has been the reason I haven't gone into too much depth, is that I don't want to retread old territory. It has been covered on the channel.
Indeed.
In a stream called The Forgotten Germans, where I
Mm.
talked to Professor Otto Poll, and it's not just focused on the Prussian Germans, it's focused on all of the Eastern Germans. There is one point, actually, to make, which is what happened to Austria. Because, like I said, in terms of the singling out of Prussiadom, Hitler identified as Bavarian. I mean, he was Bavarian from blood because he came from Braunau, which was part of the Innsbayern, which was only given over to Austria in the Potato War in 1779. So it was only a recent addition to Austria, in the same way that Salzburg was only a recent addition to Austria. But Bavarians over-indexed in the National Socialist movement. However, also Stauffenberg was a Bavarian. Austrians over-indexed in the movement, and indeed you can say that the origins for the radical folkish nationalism, which is anti-dynastic, is in response to the loss of the Klein-Deutschland solution and the Habsburg preservationism vis-a-vis unification with the Reich. And then you have figures like Schonerer, who are in many ways antecedents. And yet Prussia was singled out. And like I said, it seems to be somewhat arbitrary, in the sense that Austria was able to fashion for itself, basically after the dissolution of the empire, a distinct cultural character for itself, which the Allies tolerated. And indeed, you have to think about this very cynically. I mentioned the fact that the Allies were determined to destroy Prussia in part because Stalin was going to use Prussia as a way to keep Germany united, as it had in 1919. But the Allies basically did the same thing in reverse to the Russians, to the Soviets in Austria, when it was given its independence and permanent neutrality in 1955, because the Russians were able to achieve that scenario of basically having a united independent state in the form of Austria. And that was basically predicated on establishing a new identity where Austria forever will be separated from Germany and politically neutral and distinct. And that's still part of a legacy that continues to this day. So I just want to point out that, again, as a historian looking at this, you have to understand that there's a whole level of arbitrariness, realpolitik, and confectioner's history in terms of understanding this, to the point that it's all somewhat fake and has to be dissected and deconstructed.
Just as a final point, too, because I know it's been mentioned in other streams, but just because of sort of tangents to the fact we've spoken about the distinction between the National Socialist government and like the ideas of Prussianism, and the fact that the people who ultimately within, shall I say, the broad right wing, who opposed Hitler and actually acted against him, were of that old Prussian sort of caste, as it were, that sort of that officer class and their cultural milieu. Is that the founder of the Kreisau Circle, or is it, they say in German, the Kreisau Kreis, the circular circle, was Helmuth James von Moltke. As you say, he was a relative of the Moltke family, and their estate was in Kreisau, which is in Silesia, and that amongst the circle was trying to think, a descendant of von York. I'm just trying to think of his name. Helmuth James von Moltke, and these are aristocratic names of some gravity in German history. They're not unimportant people.
Peter Graf von Wartenburg.
Exactly.
that who
Thank you.
you're
Yeah.
talking about? Yep.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Peter Georg von Wartenberg. Thank you. And and these are people of great prominence in Germany from esteemed families, and so it shouldn't be actually understated the degree to which the legacy. These were sort of like blue blood Prussians in every sense of the word, and it was sort of via these individuals, whereby the initial sort of there was always that vein of skepticism about the Nazis, in particular Hitler, but it was that created the genesis for the events and actions that led to the events of the Stauffenberg plot of 44. Just wanted to mention that. Like I'm sure
No,
we mentioned the Valkyrie stream, but it's probably worth mentioning in the context of this.
I mean, what you're saying is actually indicative of, again, something much more sinister regarding the de-Prussification elements.
Indeed,
What
indeed.
you're basically describing, and it's something that I really need to emphasize, unless it was only implicit before, is that Prussia was the only element within National Socialist Germany that was capable of resistance. Austria didn't put up resistance. And Bavaria, again, looking at this from the very arbitrary point of view, Bavaria was the original engine of budding National Socialism. Munich was effectively the party capital in the same way that Berlin was the national capital. Nuremberg, which is the capital of Franconia, was basically seen as another symbolic capital. All of these are part of Bavaria, Nuremberg and Munich. And yet it was Prussia was the element that was demonized. It was Prussia that the Allies would not countenance negotiations with, even if they managed to depose Hitler. It was Prussia, the elements that were anti-Hitler, that were not received basically warmly in terms of the prospect of a color revolution or resistance during the Second World War. So if anything, it compounds and redoubles the tragedy to the fact that the vilification applied to the only source of antipathy, I don't mean the only source, I mean the actionable source of antipathy, the one that could actually,
Functional
the
force,
functional source of antipathy to National Socialism, as opposed to the more general source of antipathy when it pertains to things like members of the Catholic Church, members of the Communists and the Socialist Resistance, etc. In terms of the actual power to affect change, we see it in terms of that Prussian antipathy, but that was as much vilified as we see National Socialism.
I was going to say, did not avoid its scapegoating.
Yes, exactly. All right. We're in the stream
Chats.
after super chats, right?
Mhm.
New gunslinger. Sounded like Prussia was the guinea pig for what the liberal world order would do to countries like Rhodesia. Not. I mean, the Rhodesia example is very particular. Like I said, it seemed that Rhodesia was a victim of decolonization specifically. I mean, if you want examples of comparisons with Prussia and wholesale sort of population transfers, you can look, say, for example, to the example. You can look to the example in Czechoslovakia. You can look to the forced population movements within Russia itself. So perhaps a very pertinent example to point to is actually what happened to the Crimean Tatars and the fact that they were forcefully removed. The area was Russified and the population was moved, I believe, to Kazakhstan. So there were elements where the Prussian example was repeated and the culture was basically, glassed over by something else. But Rhodesia is quite specific. I wouldn't necessarily draw the comparison there. Spasticus Autisticus for my goodness, £100. Thank you very much. Fantastic. So thank you very much. Fantastic stream, AM. Love your work and appreciate the effort you put into it. Well, thank you very much.
Don't we all?
It does genuinely mean so much. TL so thank you again. TL for $5. Any hot takes on AFD inheriting the husk of Prussia, in the sense that AFD is actually, weirdly enough, the successor of Honecker's Soviet Prussiandom, which would explain why the AFD is doing so much better in East Germany than they are in West Germany. Other than that, I don't see any example of a genuine Prussian resurgence. Like I said, the territory in the east of the Oder-Neissau line is lost forever, and you're going to have some sort of aristocratic royal renaissance, and I don't see that happening. The eccentric tripper for $5. Great show, AM. We love you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Try to ask a question, but the algorithm won't let it through. If you're live in the soup chat, it would be cool if you give me thoughts. Okay, what question are you referring to?
If you're still here with us, Eccentric Tripper, repost in the
No,
main
I
chat.
think I found it. Given the apparent success of
Okay.
de-Prussification, what would a Morgenthau Germany look like today? Well, I'm going to be slightly subversive and say that the German government is currently implementing the Morgenthau plan on its own volition.
And slightly the speed limit, but yes.
Yes, I wouldn't even say a modest, but they're definitely attempting a form of deindustrialization. Yeah, poor Germany is all I can say.
Voluntary Morgenthauism.
Yes, yes, that'll own the legacy of German nationalism. Anyway, Furious, anything you'd like to say before we get out of here?
Not really, but I've definitely enjoyed being back at the helm. I know we've done a couple streams, actually, like in a week and a half or so. So it's been lovely to be back. Yeah, if we have other topics that sort of cross our paths and we share mutual interest in, happy to return as always. Love our peers and our friends and followers in the chat. It's always good to discuss history. And I mean, this is the thing too. I think I mentioned in the other stream that obviously my wheelhouse is sort of Greco-Roman history, but I do have a soft spot for modern, even medieval Germany is interesting, but even like modern German history and Prussia. And that's the thing too. Like I was arguably a bit ignorant about Austria, and over the years I've learned a lot of you about the Habsburgs and and the Austrian realm, and so these topics do bring me quite a lot of delight, and they are internally interesting. And I think for anyone who wants a healthy perspective of the West and how we have come to be where we are today, one can't do without understanding, you might say, the history and the fate of the Central Powers, to use a descriptor. And I think it's very fundamental to getting a grasp of it. So, again, I appreciate, as always, the research, the thorough work you put into these streams, and I'm glad to be along for the ride. So thank you for having me on again.
Well, you never know. If one day Richard Evans acknowledges my existence, I could become embroiled in a wonderful infamy-making, publicity-earning historical-strike. So wonderful. I'll be prepared for that. Okay.
Wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.